right. Okay, so welcome back from lunch, everyone. We're going to settle. We're going to get started. Oh, hi. Okay, we're ready to go? So I'm pleased to announce that we are back on time, so that's very exciting for me and the other organizers. Oh, thank you. So we are moving on now in our schedule to the very excitingly titled panel, The Promise and Perils of Anti-Bias Training. We're going to hear from four really great scholars in this area, and then we'll get a chance to hear your questions. Basically, I'm just here to read your questions. So we will get started. So we're going to start with Edward Chang, who is just here to my left from Harvard Business School. He'll be talking about whether or not diversity training changes employee behavior. Then we'll hear from Ivuoma, who's here from Kellogg at Northwestern University, who's going to talk about policy insights for increasing organizational diversity. Then we'll hear from Devine, who is here from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's going to be talking about breaking the habit of unintentional bias. And then finally, we'll hear from Hilary Bergsieker, who's also over there, who is joining us from the University of Waterloo. We'll be talking about a randomized controlled field experiment to foster allyship toward women. So I think this panel is particularly interesting because we're going to hear about interventions that target so many different levels. So we have individual, we have organizational, all the way up to policy. So I'm thrilled to welcome our first speaker, Edward Chang. Also thrilled to welcome the other three, but I won't be coming back. So just take that now. And then Edward, you can start.
Great, thank you. I do want to say, I think we only have 15 minutes, but the clock says 20, but I'm only going to take 15. Great, okay. So I'm really excited to be here and to talk about some of my research about trying to better understand kind of what are the actual consequences of the sorts of diversity training that are really commonplace in companies. Like, what do they actually do? And I mean, as many of you are probably familiar, there's a lot of money and time devoted to diversity trainings in organizations today. So by some estimates, people spend, or organizations are spending up to $8 billion a year when you think about the amount of employee time and the consultant time and the learning and development time that's devoted to this topic. But in spite of the fact that companies are spending so much time and resources on training, there's actually not very much empirical evidence testing whether or not these sorts of trainings that companies are doing, whether they're actually leading to changes in behavior. And so this is a question in graduate school that I was really interested in. And so with a lot of amazing co-authors at Wharton, we tried to better understand and test, are these sorts of diversity trainings, are these sorts of kind of implicit bias, unconscious bias trainings that companies are implementing, what are the actual consequences on employee workplace behaviors? So what did we do? So we ran a large-scale field experiment with a global professional services firm. So this field experiment involved employees at this firm from over 60 different countries around the world. The majority of the employees were based in the US, though, and we recruited about 3,000 of their employees across the globe. We recruited employees to take part in what we were calling an inclusive leadership training. We kind of called it inclusive leadership. We didn't specifically call it diversity or implicit bias training because we wanted to randomly assign people to either a diversity training we had created or to an active placebo-controlled training. So the active control training, so these people also did a training, but it did not talk about bias or implicit bias. It didn't talk about stereotypes. It was just something that they would do so we could be sure that we're looking at the effects of diversity training or unconscious bias training specifically, as opposed to just doing any sort of training at all. Now, our training drew on kind of the best practices that we saw in the academic literature about how to generate behavior change from these sorts of relatively short interventions, as well as trying to model it off of what are companies actually doing. So we talked about research, for example, showing how stereotypes can negatively affect outcomes for different groups in the workplace. So for example, this is a slide summarizing some research from Linda Babcock and colleagues about non-promotable tasks and how gender stereotypes can lead women to engage in more of these non-promotable tasks at work. We had participants take an implicit association test and gave them feedback about their levels of implicit associations to try to kind of spark individual motivation. And we provided research-backed strategies about ways for people to potentially overcome the negative effects of stereotyping in the workplace. For example, talking about anonymization strategies about to remove identifying information, And we gave people opportunities to practice implementing these strategies in different kind of workplace scenarios. In terms of what we measured, we first looked at people's attitudes at the end of training. So we looked at things like essentially modern sexism, but our field partner didn't want us to call it modern sexism, but we're calling it support for women. Whether people would acknowledge their own biases, like to acknowledge that, yes, I perhaps hold gender or racial biases. And we designed a situational judgment test to look at what are their intentions to behave inclusively in different workplace situations. But more importantly, we looked at real workplace behaviors. So we followed these employees for several months after the training took place. They didn't know we were following them. And we measured their actual behaviors in a variety of different workplace programs that they had no idea were connected to the training itself. So specifically, we looked at who they chose to informally mentor in the workplace, who amongst their peers they would recognize for doing good work. And we also actually did an audit study of all of the participants where we sent them emails being like, would you be willing to volunteer to help time to either help a male or female new hire, and looked at kind of differences in response rates. So there's going to be a lot of results, but the way you're going to read this chart is the blue dots are essentially estimated treatment effects. There are 95% confidence intervals and horizontal lines around those, and the vertical lines represent 0. So if the horizontal bars don't overlap the vertical line, that's a significant effect. So you can see that first, training does change attitudes. So we see significant effects on all 3 of our attitude measures. So increased support for women in the workplace, increased acknowledgement of their own biases, and increased intentions to behave inclusively. So this is all positive. This is first at top with the overall effects. We also broke it down by different demographic subgroups. In general, we see positive effects overall. You do see that there are null effects on the left for women and employees in the US. These are just ceiling effects. Like already, women in the US were very, very supportive of women in the workplace. There essentially was no room on the scale for them to go. So that's why you see null effects. But so in general, like it's positive that the training does seem to change people's attitudes. It seems that you can teach people things, great. But unfortunately, we don't see any evidence of overall change on any of our behavioral measures. So up top, we see significant effects on attitudes. Below, null effects. When we look at different demographic subgroups, in general, we see null effects pretty much across the board, although there is kind of one major exception, which I'll dive into right now. So one of these behavioral measures was we were looking at informal mentoring in the workplace, and our field partner created a new program where they essentially were paying for people to go on coffee chats to foster this informal mentorship at work. And so employees received an email saying, we have this new program at work, we're willing to pay for you to go on these coffee chats, tell us who you want to kind of provide this informal mentorship to. And we were interested, are people who went through this diversity training, are they going to select more women than those who went through the controlled training? Again, overall, we find no significant differences. This is just the same result, just presented another way. But when we looked into different demographic subgroups, we find the significant effect among women in the US. So women in the US are selecting significantly more women if they went through the diversity training than if they went through the controlled training. And we were really intrigued by this. So we tried to dig in more to see like what's really driving this, what's sparking this change in behavior. And when we looked into, well, what's really driving this effect, to our surprise, it was not kind of more senior women choosing to provide informal mentorship or peer mentorship to more junior women. It was actually more junior women using this program to seek out mentorship from more senior women, and in general, more senior colleagues. So if we looked at this to look at more senior men, you'd also see this effect. And so the largest behavioral consequence of this diversity training was to essentially prompt these junior women to be more proactive about their advancement at this company, to prompt them to seek out mentorship from more senior colleagues. And in part, maybe this makes sense. We had them sit through a diversity training that essentially said, there's bias in the workplace, there are stereotypes, women are disadvantaged. And again, the main consequence seems to be that it prompted these women to essentially lean in and be more proactive. But I will note that I don't think this is the result or the consequence of diversity training that probably most organizational leaders are expecting. That I think we see no evidence of behavior change among men or white people who are kind of people who are overrepresented in this organization, who historically have held more power and higher status positions. And so I think it suggests that these diversity trainings that these companies are implementing, while they may have potential short-term benefits in terms of people's attitudes or intentions. They don't seem to be changing the behaviors of those groups who historically have held more power in these organizations. And while we do find some evidence of behavior change, again, behavior change seems to be concentrating amongst a relatively underrepresented group in this organization as opposed to a group that's held more power. So what should we do instead? So this is something I've been thinking a lot about since doing this research. To be clear, I'm not saying that we should not do diversity training. That is not the takeaway I'm leaving, but at least as it's commonly implemented in organizations, it's maybe not doing what I think organizational decision makers maybe expect. And instead, what I've been thinking about a lot is, well, what if you just made training more timely and targeted? And so I think in general, most people don't really go around the world thinking like, today's a really good day for me to be sexist, or today's a really good day for me to be racist. I think most people at least explicitly espouse egalitarian values. But I think for many people, it's just often not that salient to them that a given decision that they're making is going to have consequences for equity in their organization. So for example, a hiring decision is that hiring decisions obviously are very consequential, but it just might not be that salient to people that, okay, when I'm making this hiring decision, it actually could potentially have consequences for equity in my organization, or I should be thinking about diversity in this decision, as much as we might hope that people do think about that. And I think the problem with a lot of the way diversity training is implemented today in organizations is that oftentimes it's a one-time thing. Like you might maybe do it when you first get onboarded, or maybe you do it once a year. And that can be very kind of disconnected from when you actually make a decision like a hiring decision. And I would say that these trainings are also relatively diffuse in that they cover lots of different topics. Maybe it's not always clear how to translate those to specific decisions or how you might apply those insights to specific decisions. So in another field experiment, which is ongoing work, we've run the field experiment, we're writing up now. So we worked with a different global field partner where we randomized about 7,000 of their hiring managers to either receive an email right before they shortlisted CVs. So hiring managers said they want to hire someone, so they list the job on the website, they get some applications, and before the essentially HR partner is like, you can look at CVs to shortlist people, we send hiring managers either a treatment video or they don't get anything. And the treatment video, essentially, it's like a diversity training, but it's very short. So and it's timely in the fact that they're doing this right before they kind of review resumes. And the video essentially is a video made by the company which says, we care about diversity, and you're about to make an important decision, and we encourage you to think about, instead of just trying to hire someone who looks like you, to think about maybe what is your team missing, or what are the perspectives your team is missing. And we actually find that this treatment does actually influence who the hiring managers hire. It leads to more women being hired, and it leads to, we don't have race because it's a global sample, but it leads to more non-nationals being hired. And so I think it suggests that we can maybe reimagine diversity training in new ways to try to make training as maybe a nudge to make diversity more salient in consequential decisions. So if we were to, for example, make it more, for a hiring decision, if we're to make it more timely and targeted by having kind of training right before a hiring decision, or right before promotion decisions are made, or right before annual evaluations are made, that we might be able to kind of spark people's general desires to kind of be more egalitarian to actually change behavior in ways that kind of existing forms of diversity training do not seem to be super successful. Okay, thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Ivuoma. I'm a professor at Kellogg. And today my talk is entitled Moving Beyond Implicit Bias Training, Organizational Insights for Managing, Policy Insights for Managing Organizational Diversity. It's based on a piece that I published a few years ago at Policy Insights from the Brain and Behavioral Sciences, if you want to see more. So over the last few years, several companies have faced allegations of discrimination and have had to wrestle with how to address these allegations. One response that's really common, as we've heard a little bit about already, is that they announce that their employees at large are going to undergo diversity trainings. And so, for example, a few years ago, you might have heard about what happened at Starbucks in Philadelphia. 2 black men were waiting for a business meeting and they hadn't ordered anything yet. And a white barista chose to call the police on them for this, and a video of that incident went viral. And so in response, Starbucks decided to shut down all 8,000 of its US stores for a training, which they initially referred to as an implicit bias training. The full training is actually available online, and it's a really vivid example of how companies are engaging on this issue. And so, like I said, they initially referred to it as an implicit or unconscious bias training. But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are automatically activated negative associations that reflect prejudice or stereotypes. And so the idea is that implicit biases can negatively affect decision-making and behavior towards members of stigmatized groups. And so many researchers point to implicit bias as an explanation for why disparities are persisting despite warming attitudes, explicit attitudes. And so it's increasingly used to explain diversity and inclusion challenges, including through training, but I'm arguing that we need to move beyond this framing so that the organizations can actually produce full inclusion of racial minorities and women. Okay, so, there's something going on over here. Okay. So recent findings from my field, I'm a social psychologist, raise challenges for implicit bias, this implicit bias training approach that many companies are taking. And so in line with what Edward was talking about, it turns out that implicit bias is resistant to change. It's very difficult to change implicit bias. So some of my colleagues conducted a comparative evaluation of several different implicit bias trainings from the literature, and they found that only 8 of the 17 interventions that have been published successfully reduced implicit bias in a single shot experiment. And then even amongst those that were effective, reductions in implicit bias faded after 24 hours. So these trainings, these interventions that we're doing, even if we're able to shift implicit bias, this is not a long-lasting change. Further, another competitive big study that they did found that the changes in implicit bias were not associated with changes in explicit bias or changes in behavior. So even if we are able to change implicit bias through training or through some sort of intervention, it's not necessarily leading to a reduction in discrimination or changes in explicitly held attitudes. And finally, there's been very little evidence that diversity trainings are affecting implicit. There's some maybe evidence, Edward showed us, for explicit attitudes, but certainly not able to change implicit attitudes in the long term. And I have some data in a project where we followed physicians over the course of their medical training, and diversity training, self-reported numbers of hours of diversity training was actually negatively associated with explicit attitudes. So the more training that they went to, the less positively they felt towards Black people. So that's bad. We don't want that. And so why is there this focus on implicit bias training? Practitioners and some of us as social psychologists have argued that because white people get defensive when we talk about racism or explicit bias, that implicit bias might help with that because it's outside of our control. It's part of our cognitive architecture. I've sat through many different, we all have it, everybody has it. And I'm like, well, okay, hold on, because even if everyone can exhibit bias, certainly we don't all exhibit the same level or amount of bias or implicit or otherwise. Anyway, that's my own personal rant. This all started in grad school. I was like, what's going on? We're talking all about implicit bias, but we can't actually change it. Anyway, So because of this defensiveness, there was an attempt to shift the framing of trainings to be focusing on implicit biases, because maybe that would be more accessible for people. But there's actually research showing that white people are also defensive about implicit biases and even information that they may have implicit biases. So I don't know that these trainings are necessarily reducing the defensiveness. Further, there's research finding that when you ask people to take responsibility for their bias and for their implicit bias, people who are low in IMS, so this internal motivation to respond without prejudice, the people we might particularly want to undergo training and see shifts, when they're asked to take responsibility for their implicit biases, there are backlash effects such that they express more explicit bias against the targeted group and are less likely to donate to Black organizations. So implicit bias and having to take responsibility for it is also resulting in backlash. And so perhaps even more concerningly in some of my work, we found that when incidents of discrimination are framed in terms of implicit rather than explicit bias, perceivers actually believe that discrimination is less intentional and are less willing to punish perpetrators of discrimination. So in this study, we had participants read a news article about an incident of discrimination or about disparities by race, and we either attributed those disparities or the discriminatory incident to implicit bias, to explicit bias, or in the control condition, there's no mention. And we find that, as you might expect, intent is perceived to be lower in the implicit bias condition compared to the explicit bias condition. But simply raising the idea of implicit bias doesn't necessarily mean that it's operating. We don't actually know whether the person is intending discrimination or not. And that reduced intent is resulting in reduced willingness to hold people accountable for discrimination. And so while implicit bias has been an important discovery, I don't want to upset anyone, but given these issues, we might want to move beyond that framing in terms of our approach to interventions in organizations. And I've been really happy to see today all the discussion of structural interventions and the context and things like that. My contention is that organizations really need to be thinking more about those sorts of interventions and that type of approach as opposed to the simple implicit bias framing. And so I argue that we should think about interventions in terms of, with respect to the following insights. So rather than thinking that trainings are going to magically increase representation or totally change the climate of an organization, that might be too high of an expectation for a training. Companies should use trainings to educate people about bias and how it manifests, and about organizational efforts to address diversity, equity, and inclusion. So training is a class, essentially. It's teaching. And so that's what it can do. It can teach. But beyond that, it can't, totally transform organizations. And organizational leaders should prepare for, rather than try to accommodate, defensive reactions. So these topics, these things that we're thinking about, do make people defensive. It's difficult stuff. It implicates who we are and morality and things like that. And rather than how can we talk about this in a way that doesn't make people defensive, we should expect that people will be defensive and think about what do we need to do so that we can help people deal with that defensiveness, we can move forward, et cetera. And finally, organizations should implement structures that foster organizational responsibility for diversity, equity, inclusion goals. So as Edward mentioned, companies are spending up to $8 billion on diversity trainings, and these trainings do often focus on unconscious or implicit bias. A recent review of diversity trainings finds that participants do successfully learn the concepts taught, and there is some evidence of attitude change, and these interventions are more successful, these trainings are more successful when they're implemented alongside other organizational strategies, a broader diversity and inclusion strategy. But diversity trainings have limited, if any, utility for increasing the underrepresentation of people of color and can result in some defensiveness and feeling of exclusion amongst whites. So trainings are likely to continue to be offered, and my colleagues and I a few years ago wrote a paper about how companies can develop and deliver effective diversity trainings. And so we offer 5 challenges to developing effective and evidence-based trainings, and then we make 5 recommendations for organizational leaders. So I'll go through a few of these. One challenge is being realistic about what training can accomplish on its own, which I've sort of tried to lay out for you all already. Sometimes we're pinning all our diversity hopes and dreams on this one-shot training, and these are long-standing issues that are going to take more work to address. And so we recommend that instead organizations develop a more comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategy with training as just one component. And then conduct research about the particular issues in your context, and then think about what kinds of interventions would be necessary to solve that challenge, because the issues are myriad and the challenges need to be tailored, the interventions need to be tailored to whatever challenge we're discussing. So as a concrete example, a few years ago at the Kennedy School at Harvard, they were facing complaints about a lack of gender representation. And in the course of trying to figure out what to do, they realized they'd never kept track of the ratio of men to women in their syllabi, amongst their visiting speakers, case protagonists, et cetera. And so once they realized this, they could take a more retrospective look, see what the metrics were, and then set goals for improvement, which were more concrete and which people could be held accountable for and to. And so in workplaces, as we try to address these issues, we encourage in this work that people think about what metrics really matter, not just in terms of hiring, but who's receiving mentorship, sponsorship, professional development activities, and so on. Okay. In some of my work, we find that people vastly overestimate economic equality between blacks and whites. So the red dots along the bottom are the actual ratio of wealth between black families and white families. So it ranges between $5 for every $100 that a white family has to up to 10. And then the black dots are what people expect it is over time. So and that gap is the overrepresentation. And so people have kind of no idea the depth of the inequality and the disparities. This is in terms of wealth, but that's also the case in terms of our organizations. The one black colleague you saw 3 weeks ago you might think, oh, we have some diversity going on. But if we were to actually look at the data, we'd have a clearer sense of the gaps, and that might motivate more action. So basically this point is it's important for organizations to investigate where they are at baseline as they design their strategies. When we inform people about the extent of the disparities, defensive responses can emerge, as I've talked about. In another paper, we tried to help white participants be more accurate in their perceptions of this wealth disparity. So we asked them to read an article about the persistence of discrimination, and in the control condition, they either didn't read anything or they read about left-handedness. And so what you can see is that when they read about the persistence of racism, they do estimate less progress. They're less likely to overestimate, but you can see they're still overestimating. Unfortunately, that doesn't impact their estimates of the present. So the reduction in estimated progress is because when they read about racism, they're reporting more equality than they would have otherwise. And part of what we think is going on, I argue this is a defensive response. You're telling me that racism has persisted from the 1960s to today. I'm committed to my understanding of the present, and so then the past must not have been as bad as I thought otherwise. And so the fact that this defensive response exists doesn't mean that we should sort of not talk about the persistence of racism, but in future work we want to show people these data and perhaps try to inoculate, like Buju was talking about, inoculate them against the defensive responses. This is how other people have responded, and try to see if we can help people move beyond that initial defensive response. Okay, I think this is in a different order, but so you see this defensiveness, and thinking about, as you're planning your trainings, you can think about how can you help attendees manage the discomfort that may inevitably arise. All right. And so finally, I want to offer that with trainings, it's important to demonstrate impact. So I've sat in on lots of trainings and consulted on lots of trainings, and often they kind of do the training and we all move on and don't talk about it again. But it would be good to know what is the impact that we're hoping to have. Can we measure this beforehand, just after, and downstream, so that we can see, does this training have any impact? Does the strategy that we're implementing have any impact? And is there any backlash? Because importantly, there, again, like we're talking about, there are defensive responses. And if we're not collecting data before, just after, and later on down the line, we can't identify those potential backlash effects either. Addressing individuals has its limits, as many of us have talked about today. And so in the piece, we offer suggestions for organizational structures that can be implemented to address DEI. They are organizational responsibility, and these are based on in the literature. So organizational responsibility for diversity, equity, and inclusion, a chief diversity officer, and not just a figurehead, but someone who has power in the organization and power to hold people accountable. Opportunities for high quality intergroup contact. Organizational groups for underrepresented members, so ER, employee resource groups and the like. Organizational messaging that's welcoming and inclusive, and organizational processes that bypass interpersonal bias, so blinding resumes, things like that. So I won't go into more detail about this because I'm out of time, but I wanted to thank my co-authors on this paper and all of you for your time and attention.
Trish is next. However, we're just going to make sure that everything's okay with the slides. Ivy had some trouble, so we're just making sure it's all good. No, you had trouble. I just want to make sure, we're just making sure it's okay. But I'll use this time to remind everyone that you can submit your questions for the speakers on Slido. If you're asking a question for a particular speaker, please make sure that you include their names in it. And we're good? Okay. Trish Devine. Here we go.
Sonia, I want to thank you for being thrilled to welcome me here. I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank Tony and the members of the team for the invitation to come and address this group. I don't like going this late in the day because it's not because of the after lunch slump or something, but I've had so many thoughts going on about all the other presentations that focusing on what I'm going to say is a little difficult right now. But in fact, I think there are a lot of themes that came up today that will be represented in some of the remarks that I make. And in fact, I could say my talk is part of what Frank said, and part of what Ivy said, part of what Sarah said this morning, right? There are all of these things that come together. So what's the core problem that I've been working on? And really, this is for the last 40 years. It's why people display bias when they don't intend to. These spontaneous reactions that they have, the stereotypes that pop to mind that influence their thinking and their judgments in ways that it doesn't take any effort, they don't intend that, and they very often don't notice it. You can think about what Sarah said this morning. When she sees doctors, she thinks male. In fact, if there's a male and it's a situation that calls for some medical proficiency, people think doctor, right? And so these associations are very strong, they're culturally embedded, and they become deeply ingrained in our minds. I don't really need to say much more than that about that point, given so many people have made that point throughout the course of our discussions today. What I want to talk about is how I conceptualize these rather automatic, spontaneous associations that get activated as habits of mind. They're the default kinds of responses that people have that, as I said, influence their thinking, their judgments, their behavior, and so forth. And I think that once you conceptualize these biases as a habit of mind, that metaphor can be tremendously powerful in helping to affect change. So what I have done in collaboration with a great number of people, I'll show you some of their pictures at the end of this presentation, is to try to develop an intervention that's predicated on the assumption that these biases operate like habits of mind. Then how can we break those habits? How can we equip people to be effective in disrupting these types of spontaneous reactions from influencing their behavior? So I've called this the prejudice habit-breaking intervention, the bias habit-breaking intervention, and I want to give you a sense of what the goals of this intervention are. Basically, what I hope to do through the course of these interventions is to provide people with a deep understanding of the way that race bias, gender bias, or other intergroup biases can affect judgments and behavior unintentionally. Your values may tell you one thing to do, and the spontaneous, unintentional. I don't even use the term implicit because I think people don't really know what it means, but they can understand the idea that we often think in ways that run counter to our values, counter to our intentions. So if we could do that through trying to raise awareness of personal vulnerability to unintentional bias, understand it as a habit of mind, understand the consequences of these unintended biases, and help people to identify and label common forms of bias. We talk about creating bias literacy. My colleague Molly Carnes used to say, or maybe she still does, if you can name it, you can tame it. Right? It's part of this deep understanding, if you will, of the way these biases unfold in our thinking and our behavior. The second thing that we hope this intervention will do is to enlist people as agents of change and to empower them to reduce bias in self-sustaining ways. All right? One of the things we've seen is that people are very much concerned about one and done types of things. We did our diversity training, we're done, we're good, and so forth. But that's only true insofar as, well, it's not true, actually, it's bad. But if we could create circumstances where people carried the messages forward in their own activities over time, self-sustaining ways, we might be able to make progress on these issues. So here I like to talk about understanding the steps involved in breaking habits, and we try to provide people with a concrete set of strategies to reduce the influence of unintended biases. Give them something to work on. All right? And I'm going to give you a feel for how this intervention is structured in just a moment. And finally, what we hope the intervention will do is produce bias-reducing effects. All right? So it's sort of simple in conceptualization in some ways, but let me give you a feel for how this intervention works. And I should have had, was it Katie? She should have done my slides because I'm terrible at slide construction, and I didn't call on any of my students to help me this time. All right? So there's a number of different components here, and I want to give you an idea of what the conceptual purpose of each component is, give you an idea of what the participant experience is, and then what the overall learning objective is. So the first thing talks about raising awareness of one's own personal vulnerability to these types of unintended biases. Across many experiments, we've done this in different ways. Sometimes we give people an IAT and they get their feedback. Other times we use powerful anecdotes to help them understand how vulnerable they are to these types of associations. And we've done it with a number of different methods. So sometimes it's a computer-controlled program, slideshow presentation narrated. Sometimes it's been a workshop where we've had people in the audience. Other times I now have produced a video of lots of me presenting the elements of this intervention. But the goal is to understand that bias is ordinary, pervasive, and not a moral failing, right? I mean, this defensiveness comes up when people feel like it's a moral failing. But if we can understand the pervasiveness, the embeddedness of bias in culture and the way that people develop these biases, we can prevent, hopefully, them from feeling that threat, that finger coming up, pointing at them that they're the racist, the sexist, the ageist, or what have you. All right, so then we want them to learn the elements, the basis of the habit model. And I've already described some of this, but that stereotypes and biases spring to mind without intention, effort, and often without awareness, constrain opportunities for people, right? If you only think about men as leaders, then women may not have a chance, right? All right, it can make people feel devalued and as though they're not welcomed or they don't belong in an organization. So to help people understand that, we give them information about the early and frequent exposure to stereotypes that lead to these deeply ingrained associations in their mind, and help them to understand how they could be unwittingly, unintentionally complicit in the perpetuation of discrimination. The consequences are there. They're real. You may not have intended them, but that may be a way in which I think of people putting themselves on the hook. I don't want to put them on the hook. If that's not going to be effective, they need to put themselves on the hook for addressing it. Then we... Sorry, I have a bit of a cold. Then we tell them about the steps involved in breaking a habit. First thing, you have to be motivated. It's got to come from within. You have to be aware of when it is you are vulnerable to expressing bias, because that's very, very powerful. That's a leverage point for disrupting bias. You need to understand some strategies. You have to have some tools. I mean, telling people, raising awareness may be necessary, but it's clearly not sufficient to address these powerful biases. So they need to have strategies, they need tools to address it, and they need to know, I mean, have any of you tried to break a habit? Does it happen overnight? You got to work at it over time, right? There's got to be part of your ongoing experience in this context with intergroup biases. I have no idea why the sizes are different. Is this the PowerPoint version? Okay, so I work in Keynote, but I exported it to PowerPoint, and it all looked the same to me. But anyway, this is well, I'll make sure you understand it. So developing this bias literacy, one of the things that we want to do is to help people understand the ways in which stereotype-based expectations influence what people notice and remember about others. And here we talk about the powerful role of things like confirmation bias, how our attention is drawn like a spotlight to those things that we expect to see, often stereotype congruent information, and away from, this is not intentional, but away from evidence that might challenge their stereotypes. We talk about how stereotypes can influence how we interact with others, and many in this audience are familiar with the phenomenon of self-fulfilling prophecy, that once we have an expectation, we interact with people in a way to draw out those very behaviors we expected to see and recognize our own role in pulling out those behaviors we expect to see. Stereotype-based expectations also affect what we think people should be like. The prescriptive expectations that men should be leaders and women should. We saw all of these data throughout today's sessions where there are expectations that women are for the home situation, taking care of kids and so forth, right? So once you understand those types of processes and the way they can influence your behavior, your thinking in subtle, powerful, and pernicious ways, we're hoping that that would actually help people to understand the negative consequences and motivate them to want to address the bias. And finally, we share with people concrete evidence-based strategies to reduce bias. I mean, people have to know what else to do. So if you could tune into and learn to detect through bias literacy when you are vulnerable to displaying bias, the question is, what the heck? Oh, good, I didn't swear. What the heck else would you do, all right? So we have sort of two main categories. One is to disrupt bias and course correct in the moment. And here you can take advantage of, these are not rocket science, stereotype replacement, individuation, paying attention to the individual qualities of people, perspective taking, considering how the situation may affect people's behavior. I'm happy to go into great detail about how these operate if you're interested later. Speak up when bias occurs. And then the second set of strategies focusing on how to plan ahead to prevent bias. I mean, oftentimes what happens, we get caught like a deer in headlights. We've made an inappropriate response, stereotypic assumption, let's say, and we don't know what to do, right? and the moment goes by, nothing happens, and so on. But we can plan ahead. If this happens, then I will do that. We can plan and practice. Commit to criteria. If you're going to do those job applications, you get that email from Frank's group that says, be very careful, and here are the criteria on which we want to evaluate all applicants, and do it before you look at any of them. You can reduce and mitigate some of these biases. Broaden experiences, contact, we heard about that before, and modifying the environment. Sapna was talking about the powerful role that images in the environment can play in affecting who feels like they belong and can succeed, right? But we can modify these things and we can create more balance in them. The goal here is for people to have self-efficacy, to work on reducing bias over time. The last two talks said, well, we better hold ourselves accountable. We better have some evidence that what we do works. And in fact, Betsy Levy-Pollock had this quote in one of her terrific papers, experimental, real-world, long-term. I've long since learned I can't read out loud, so I apologize. Experimental, real-world, long-term assessment of bias and diversity efforts should be considered an ethical imperative on the level of rigorous testing of medical intervention. She's not the only one who's drawn our attention to those issues, but I would submit to you, much like Ivy said, there are a lot of bias trainings out there. We did it, we go on, we don't know if it worked, we don't know if it backfired, we don't know anything about it, and we should. And we should hold ourselves accountable to doing that. So I want to share with you right now briefly, I have no idea how much time. Yeah, no. I will try to go fast, but basically what we've done to test the efficacy of this prejudice habit-breaking intervention is through randomized controlled experiments, sometimes with individuals, undergraduates, college students, sometimes with faculty in STEM departments. And we randomly assign them to the intervention or to serve as controls, and often they're waitlist controls. We've measured outcomes that should change if people pursue the goal of reducing bias and creating inclusion. We have a mix of self-report and behavioral outcomes. And importantly, as both Frank and Ivy said, we assessed outcomes over time. So we were interested not just in immediate effects, but are they sustained over time? I want to now just give you a brief sampling. The designs are really simple. There's two conditions, all right? Here we looked at the extent to which people showed changes in their concern about discrimination as a social problem. And we have measures at baseline, 2 weeks after they were randomly assigned to intervention or control conditions, and 6 weeks out. And what you can see is at the outset, intervention and control participants don't differ in how concerned they are about discrimination. But we see here for the dashed line, the control participants, they don't change over time, but we see an increase at week 2 out to week 6, and we've seen it out now 2 years. That people remain concerned about discrimination as a social problem. Do they become more aware of their own bias? And what you can see in the control condition, at the baseline, there's no difference. The control condition remains flat, and the intervention condition increases at 2 weeks, and it sustains out to 6 weeks. That turns out to be important because they are detecting bias, and that's a critical step to try to then learn to prevent bias. We have other self-report measures about awareness and concern about race and gender bias, but we also have motivation to address race and gender bias, and self-efficacy, which is a theme that came up in a number of the presentations as well. But does it affect their behavior? Wow, that says stereotype inference. So again, PowerPoint to Keynote, or Keynote to PowerPoint didn't quite work. But this is a stereotype inference measure developed by Margot Monteith and her group. And what we can see here is that those who are in the control condition show more evidence of stereotyping. This is now several weeks out compared to intervention participants. Does it change their behavior when they see bias in the environment? Oh man. This is the percent of people who challenge bias in statements that someone makes, all right? And here, this is 2 years after an intervention, and we can see that the control participants are much less likely than their intervention counterparts to challenge and explain why the comments that an essay writer made were incorrect. This is what I really want to share with this group, all right? So if I could just go, well, it says 0, so I don't know how many minutes I've gone over, but here, I don't need to tell this group about the problem of gender in STEM departments. The point has been made numerous times today, but it's the underrepresentation of women in those departments and the fact that they don't feel like they belong, okay, or that their work is particularly valued. And NIH was concerned about this in the context of implicit or unintentional bias, and they funded Molly Carnes and I to do a cluster randomized controlled experiment at the University of Wisconsin, where we took all 92 STEM departments and we matched them as closely as possible for size, disciplinary focus, gender representation, and so on. And then we took and randomly assigned one of each pair to receive a 3-hour workshop, all right, or to be in a waitlist control. So that's the basic design, right? We've got these 46 matched pairs. And then we have outcomes that we collected 3 days and 3 months later. And what we find in these self-reported outcomes is that the faculty and intervention departments reported greater awareness of gender bias, greater self-efficacy to promote gender bias, and by the 3-week mark, the 3-month mark, they said they had taken action to promote gender equity in their departments. But these are self-report items, right? And some people put stock in them, some don't. So we wanted to try to triangulate evidence to see if this intervention had effectiveness. And so we partnered with a group on campus that annually does climate evaluations in surveys that are administered to all faculty and staff. And so we were able to get access to those data, and we found some items in there that we thought were particularly important for evaluating our intervention. And these are the sort of critical items. There are others, but in this unrelated climate survey, we found that intervention department members reported that they fit better in their departments. Women reported it, and so did men. No adverse effects for men there. They felt that their scholarship was valued by their colleagues, and they felt more comfort raising family obligations, like having to go get their kids after school, right, to pick them up when the department meeting was happening. And when women would express those views, typically you find that people say, well, she's not very committed to her career. But when men express those views, what do they say? What a great dad and scholar, right? That he's celebrated for that, where the women are denigrated. So I find this a really important outcome, that people feel like they can raise and talk about these kinds of issues. But what about representation? Did this intervention have any impact whatsoever on who's represented in these departments? That on the y-axis, it's the percent of new STEM faculty who are women. And we were able to get data from Central Campus before the experiment, 2 years before, and 2 years after the experiment. And what we're interested in is the hiring rates of women in departments that became intervention compared to controls. So here are what the data look like at the outset, right, 2 years before. There's virtually no difference in the hiring of men or women, of men and women. Women were hired about 33%, all right? What about 2 years after? I should say, some places I've gone and talked about this, they go, you have that many? Right? So to sort of testify to the problem. But in the post-experimental period, 2 years later, no change in control departments. But what we see is that in intervention departments, it jumps up to about 48%, all right? That's 31 new women being hired into STEM departments at the University of Wisconsin. Now, what I wish I could tell you is exactly how this transpired. I wish I could tell you what the process was. Was it that women noticed that department climate was well, so they wanted to come to those departments and accepted offers that were given? Was it that they committed to criteria, right, to ensure that women had equal opportunity? I don't know the answers to those questions, but what I do know is that change occurred as a function of having been in the intervention departments, all right? Now, getting people, wrap up, yep, I'm going to. Getting people in the door is just the start. You have to make sure that they're going to stay, and so we're looking into that. So let me just conclude by saying empowering people with a full understanding of the obstacles to change and providing them with tools, strategies needed to effect change can produce change in a self-sustaining way. So the answer to one of Andy's questions, I think it was the last one, is I would say change is possible. And in fact, effectively empowering individuals to be agents of change within themselves can spread to the social context in which they live and they work. So I think individual change can be an important step to institutional change. But really, we got to work at this from all different angles. And what I would argue is that these biases really are multifaceted, and it's going to require a multi-pronged solution, structural kinds of efforts, individual efforts. The organizations need to support these efforts to be successful. But what I will say is that our evidence indicates that this approach, it's just one tool in the arsenal, can be effective for reducing bias, which over time can create a more positive climate related to diversity. And I'll just thank my collaborators and my funding agencies. Are you going to use this? Let me just turn it on for you.
Perfect. Wonderful. So I need to swap out slides here. Oh, it should just go. Oh, yeah, you're right. There we go. And boom. All right. Well, thank you for your attention, everyone, and the opportunity to follow in the footsteps of such amazing fellow scientists. I have to say this is the intellectual dream team for me, because these are the very people whose work we looked at when designing the research that I'll be sharing with you today. Before I get any further, I want to talk about the people who made this work possible. So special shout out, of course, to my inspirational visionary co-lead on the project, Tony Schmader, but then also to many of the student trainees and now professors and the many people who contributed. Jessica, who's sitting right here, is responsible for a lot of the analyses I'll be sharing today. I wish I could say they're hot off the presses, but they're really hot off of Jessica's laptop. So if you have questions, come talk to Jessica afterward. But and she also has a poster that she'll be sharing at this afternoon's poster session on allyship that I encourage you all to check out. But without further ado, I'm going to totally skip the why, because I think at this point, oh, and Grace is also in the back here. Yay! Grace and Emily have also been key contributors on this project. So thanks again to the team that made this possible. And the partnering organizations without which we could not have gone into STEM companies and tried to create change. So again, skipping the why, because I think we all share the goal here of advancing the inclusion of women in STEM. I'm going to get into the how and the what of what we did and what the results we're seeing are. So our fundamental question here is whether an evidence-based inclusion training could be effective, inspired by work by people like Trish, whose work, in fact, we cited in our training to try to get at whether we could kind of create actual change in these workplaces. So we were looking at, let's see, somehow slides are not advancing. Sorry, just give me a second here. We had that for a moment. Yeah, I can keep talking without the slides, but it would be great if we can get those to move forward. So, yeah, I don't know. All right, well, I'll just say, I'm going to actually talk about research that proceeded in two phases, which I could give lots of fancy accounts of, but it's really pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, because we had a bit of a disruption in March of 2020 that caused us to shift gears a bit. But we're essentially presenting the results of a randomized control trial where people, as in Edward's work, were assigned to either diversity training or an inclusion training or a leadership training. And this was a project where we were able to follow people for almost 2 years, looking at the effects of the workshop using this sort of active control. When the pandemic hit, we shifted into doing virtual workshops that we deployed, again, in a variety of different organizations, but there we were doing a waitlist control design. So we were looking at essentially what the impact of having received the training versus not yet having received the training was on employees' STEM-related attitudes, beliefs, motivations, and behaviors. In each case, we're talking about around samples of 300. I'm so envious of the 3,000 that that Edward had. But again, when you're kind of going in and doing face-to-face training in small groups with really interactive sessions, that was what we were able to do. And these are, again, thank you, perfect, much appreciated. Takes a village. All right. So again, these are the people we were able to recruit into our initial in-person workshop study, a fairly gender balanced but predominantly white, Anglophone, and straight sample. What we then did was have each of these individuals randomly assigned to participate in a 5-part workshop, starting with a sort of interactive tower building task that tied into the focus or the theme of their assigned workshop. Then a values affirmation, and this channels Ivy's work on sort of needing to prepare for rather than sort of just accommodate defensiveness. We were trying to really help break down some of the defensiveness that people might see when they might feel when they saw some threatening information about gender bias in the field by first sort of affirming the values that help them feel find meaning in those fields. Our learning unit talked, as I mentioned, among other things, about other strategies that have been shown to be effective in reducing bias. We did talk some about implicit bias, but I'll say it wasn't the real focus here. Again, inspired by a lot of the work that's out there in our field right now, we recognize it's very hard to change implicit bias, and that wasn't our goal. We were really more interested in how to mitigate bias and how essentially if people do care, are aware, and prepare strategies, they may be able to sort of mitigate the consequences of bias in their workplaces. We had people do paired dialogue, partly to help build some understanding around the lived experiences that people in these organizations have on this topic, and then finally channeling some motivation science theory and findings on implementation intentions. We had people come up with more detailed plans of what they could do either proactively or reactively in their workshop to act as allies to promote the inclusion of women in STEM. And again, people were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. Obviously, they didn't make an allyship plan. If they were in the leadership condition, they made a leadership plan and so forth. So all the content differed thematically, but the structure was otherwise the same. And then we followed people for, as I was saying, up to about 2 years later. And in terms of what we found, I'm going to start out by this question about reactance or sort of pushback, backlash from people who are skeptical. Because these, again, although these were voluntary workshops, we just called them Cultivating Collaborative Cultures, a nice generic title that doesn't give too much away. So some people showed up not even knowing that they were going to be getting a training that had anything to do with gender bias or inclusion. So we started out before the workshops by measuring people's belief that gender bias was a problem in STEM fields. And what we saw, what I'm going to show you here is evidence that the workshop had the strongest impacts for people who were low initially in acknowledging bias in STEM fields. So the people who were initially skeptical that gender bias was relevant. So I've plotted this essentially at 2 to 3 weeks post-workshop, 6 to 7 months, and then 18 to 20 months. And what we're seeing is that the strongest effects in terms of people's increased belief that gender bias is a problem in STEM were evident among the skeptics. So we felt that was kind of encouraging, that we're not just getting kind of preaching to the choir type effects here, but seeing some movement at the other end of the spectrum. In terms of turning to implicit bias, again, we did look at it. It wasn't, we had no predictions in our pre-registrations for changing implicit bias, but we were interested about its existence at the sample level. We did see evidence writ large of STEM equals male implicit association, only significant among the men, interestingly. But then using Edwards' measures of people's own bias awareness, we also found that the inclusion training significantly boosted men's awareness of their own implicit gender stereotypes in a way that sort of suggests we're building some sort of awareness of the personal relevance of this kind of training for the men in these settings. women already were more aware to begin with of their own gender stereotypes, interestingly. Turning to other impacts of the workshop, we looked at those both immediately, so in the session, but then also following them again up to 2 years later. We did give people a bias recognition test to see in sort of test scenarios if they could actually accurately distinguish scenarios with or without gender bias. We see marginal improvement there, and it was actually significant among skeptics. So that's the people who were initially skeptical that bias was a problem. So those people are learning to more accurately differentiate situations that are more or less likely to contain gender bias. We saw big increases in the workshop in sort of immediate sense in people's motivation to act as allies, and those were sustained over time, so averaging across the remaining 3 time points. We similarly saw a boost in self-efficacy to be an ally, feeling like you know how to be an ally to female scientists and engineers. However, that faded over time, so that one was not as robust or enduring in terms of what we saw up to 2 years later. Pivoting then to what people thought about the efficacy of allyship, a big focus of our program in our training was not to sort of, again, to sort of shame and name and point and accuse, but to really empower people, equip them with strategies they could use with an emphasis on allyship, the idea of men and women actually acting as allies to other women in STEM to promote inclusion. And interestingly, we saw a significant increase in the inclusion workshop and beliefs among all participants that men's allyship was effective for increasing women's inclusion in STEM. We didn't see changes in perceptions about women's beliefs. Ironically then, given that everybody agrees that the men's allyship is extra super important, and especially if they've had the inclusion training, they felt that way, it was the women who reported enacting their implementation plan, who said that they were actually taking the action that they had planned out of their workshop. But there's a little bit of an overtime piece here, sort of almost like a sleeper effect, that by the time we get to the 18 to 20 month period, there was no longer a significant gender gap. So we saw a significant linear increase over time in the extent to which men were enacting their allyship plans. Again, so that's sort of encouraging that maybe the men are just taking a little bit to shift into gear, but at least in the self-report context, they are showing some change over time. We see a null effect on this next one, so spoiler alert, this is not going to be super exciting. We did ask people in both workshops about just how often they engaged in these 3 allyship behaviors up at the top. And then we've extended this in the next study. So we're going to see this effect sort of change a little bit in the next study, but I will just say there was nothing really going on here, only a sort of small blip in the short term and the extent to which people, mostly women, said they would act as allies 2 to 3 weeks post-workshop, faded over no effects over time. Trying to be open here about what works and what doesn't work, right? Like in the spirit of transparency. We did see some encouraging evidence that fit was higher over time among people who did the inclusion versus leadership workshop. So that difference was most pronounced at the last time point. Recall that this was unfolding across the backdrop of the COVID pandemic. So we ended data collection in 2022 for this project, the period of sort of falling connection to people's workplaces more generally. So in that sense, even just maintaining feelings of fit in the workplace we think of as a win. And in terms of what might be partially explaining that, it was interesting to note that people's change from pre-workshop to immediately post-workshop and how much allyship self-efficacy they felt was then significantly predictive of feelings of fit only among people in the inclusion workshop. So hat tip to Steve Wright for that analysis suggestion. I'm going to shift gears to talk about our virtual workshops, the ones that we did starting in 2020. Right now, this is, again, a project where we have similarly a reasonable gender balance, but a predominantly white, straight, in this case, more engineering-focused sample. And we here had a slightly different design. So we randomly assigned people to participate either in a workshop kind of near the beginning of our survey sequence, where they had basically only everyone did the baseline survey and the exit survey, but some people got this workshop very early on. Some people then got the workshop almost at the end of the research project, right? So very very close to the finish, and this enabled us to do a couple kinds of analyses. So the two that I'll be presenting today include one where we're looking at these sort of midpoint surveys where we compare waitlist, the people who've not yet gotten the training to those who have. And then we're also doing some sort of analyses internally to each participant of what the workshop effects were in terms of whether they changed from pre to post. Okay, so let's talk about just briefly what we see in those midpoint models. Here we're seeing, unfortunately, replication mostly of our effects from the previous study. So we see, again, significant increases in people's awareness of their own gender stereotypes, this time not constrained just to men, and belief that gender bias in STEM fields is a problem. We did not replicate the effect for, sorry, there we go, a little summary. We did not replicate the effect for the inclusion training, increasing the belief in the effectiveness of men's allyship in this analysis. And once again, nothing was going on with people's beliefs about the effectiveness of women's allyship. Interestingly, when we look at those same research questions in this sort of pre-post design, sort of taking, it's a little more statistically powerful, right? Like taking each individual's pre-score and comparing it to their post-score. I'm just going to plot these different scores. There we see significant change across the exact same three metrics that we'd seen in the first study. So we see, again, that the inclusion workshop boosted awareness of people's own stereotypes, belief that bias is a problem, as well as their perception that men's allyship is effective for improving the landscape for women in STEM. Again, happy to chat later about how these effects might contrast with some of the findings that Buju has found for the impacts of female mentors. Again, we're not saying that women's allyship isn't effective here, but this is, again, the consistent finding across these studies and analyses. Just to wrap up here, I'll talk about two last sets of research questions. So we were interested about people's actual allyship behavior. As I alluded to here, there was a kind of exciting hypothesis confirmation. So we once again saw, as in the previous workshop, the in-person randomized control trial, we once again in this context saw that the inclusion workshop increased people's allyship motivation and self-efficacy, but then we saw newly that there was an increase in people's self-reported allyship actions, so actually taking those kinds of concrete behaviors to support women's inclusion in these settings. So that's why it's bold, because it's new and exciting. And then we replicated that finding that people who had the inclusion training versus had not yet had it had higher sense of fit in their workplace. And then these results are all substantiated looking at a pre-post model as well. So just looking at the sort of impact from before to after for participants, we see those same effects emerging. So I will wrap up. Just again, this is very much sort of a data-driven talk because these are exciting new data that we're very happy to share. But I just really want to, again, just wrap up by summarizing some evidence we're seeing that it seems like this kind of training can even reach the people who are more skeptical to begin with. We are seeing fairly robust findings for motivation and self-efficacy, whereas candidly, the results for behavior are more mixed. And again, with the caveat too, this is all self-reported behavior, that we are looking forward to diving into some dyadic analyses where people are reporting on a partner's behavior that we were able to build into that second workshop. So again, none of this could have been done without the amazing partners, some of whom are here in this room, who worked with us to go into organizations, in Erica's case, to deliver the workshops and so forth. And then just wanted to call everyone's attention to the resources available on our project website. So thanks all, and can't wait for the Q&A.
Sorry, I'll invite our other speakers back up to the stage. So Ivy, Edward, Trish, and then Hilary, you can take that seat. Okay, so before we start with questions, I just want to say that there are 23 questions for this panel. So we're not going to get to all of them, but if your question is not asked, I really encourage you to find all of the speakers afterwards. We have a break right away, so we'll be able to get to it that way. So let's dive right in. Ivy, you're right beside me, so I'll ask you the first question. So if anyone else on the panel wants to chime in after, though, feel free. So the question is from Stepna. Stepna asks, I love the idea of organizations preparing for defensiveness rather than trying to avoid it. I'm curious what organizations can do to prepare for it.
So I think I don't have data to speak to this yet, but I think I've seen it at my own institution, like, okay, we need to do some sort of diversity training, and then immediately, all of a sudden, people are like, oh, well, there's going to be these hostile people. Maybe we could do this and this and this. And so rather than, I guess my encouragement is rather than trying to water down the intervention initially, proceeding with whatever is data-driven that we know should work, and doing that, and then anticipating that there may be some resistance or something like that. I do have some other data. People vastly overestimate how much resistance there's actually going to be. Generally, I think people are kind of like, whatever, like they're going to go through the training. They're not going to sort of plan some mutiny. There's a few people who will, and those people are, but so again, just thinking about, it's not this like, vast group of people who are going to rise up. Most people actually care, I think. A lot of people do care, want this information. Some people are ambivalent or disinterested. And then there's a small group of people who are resistant. And so basically, I want organizations to kind of shift their thinking to, rather than focusing so much on those people who may be defensive, realizing that that's actually probably going to be a small group. I think just in terms of, again, totally without data, there's like something psychological, and so maybe there need to be like support groups or something like that for the defensive people. Like, you're really defensive, let's come over here and talk about it. There's soft cushions or something, whatever, I don't know. But I just think there could be different approaches as opposed to like a fear and resistance.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that question? Okay, we'll say we do have a soft cushion room.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
What I've found is that people often resonate when the approach is evidence-based. And so, I've done a lot of presentations to scientists, right? And they're going to want to know, well, what's the evidence for this or that or the other thing? And so I think when an approach is couched in evidence and then there's been evaluation of it, I've seen people start out and then slowly kind of get more chill and open in their stance, and inviting them into thinking about what the problem is and understanding it as a way to empower them to change.
Thank you. We have our next questions from Marilyn. This is a great question. It's for Edward. Edward, you mentioned women leaning into mentoring, being intentional to connect with senior women. Is there any research that supports increased DEI if training asks the highly represented to lean out to make room for the underrepresented?
Sorry, so the question's about, is there evidence of asking men to lean out?
Yeah, so rather than relying on the underrepresented groups to do the leaning, you're relying on the overrepresented groups to lean out.
So I guess, to be clear, like I'm not saying, I'm not trying to make a normative judgment that's good to make women lean in. And I think as people have talked about, like with relative to like masculine defaults, like a lot of work I think is sometimes problematically framed as like, let's fix the women or let's fix the minorities. And as many of the presentations this morning have talked about, it's like, we should also be thinking about like, maybe it's not that women are underconfident, maybe it's just that men are like wildly overconfident and they need to stop being out there as much. I unfortunately have not seen much research trying to kind of tame this overconfidence or unfounded confidence. But I definitely think it's like a potentially interesting direction for research about like maybe, and maybe if we could, for example, like relative to what Tony was saying about like make communal values more appealing to men, for example, that it might be ways to try to increase gender equity in some of these different things. But I've not personally seen much research on this yet.
Great. Hilary, I'm actually going to go to you next. We have a question from Erica. And Erica says, to what extent does the larger increase in male allyship post-workshop reflect that women were already doing allyship behaviors?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Erica. I can tell you have context here that's relevant. I think that there are concerns about ceiling effects on some of these measures. Again, especially a lot of times women in these settings, which tended to be about 20% women in a lot of the organizations we were looking at in terms of representation, are very aware of gender bias and the sort of surrounding barriers. So many of them were already highly motivated to engage with these kinds of efforts. I would add that at least in the particular context of our particular intervention, we used a sort of modeling and simulation-based approach, again, echoing what Trish said, that when you're talking to scientists and engineers, bringing data to the table really helps and really builds credibility. So we did simulations that were all about the efficacy of cross-gender allyship. So at least in terms of some of the specific patterns we're seeing where people's beliefs about women's allyship to other women didn't budge as much, I think that was also because our simulations really highlighted and focused on the potential dividends of men stepping out and acting as reactive and proactive allies to women in their workplaces. So it would be an open empirical question if you shifted the focus to sort of within group allyship, what might happen there? We don't know. We'd need to run another experiment.
Just say one thing. I was just thinking when Frank was talking, and during his talk.
Edward.
Oh, Edward, I'm sorry. I was thinking about Frank Dobbins, I'm sorry. Anyway, and I have a cold. One of the things that could be really powerful is potentially training the senior people and the junior people in different ways. And that, when I look at senior faculty, they're thinking about themselves and getting their work done and so on. They don't think to take steps to help others, but they're very receptive when someone asks for help. And so if we could think about training the senior people to be open to and receptive to those things and have that part of their responsibility, it could work in conjunction with the seemingly beneficial effect. You don't want to put all the responsibility on the junior people or the women in the gender context, but it seems like this tailoring it to the moment that you talked about could be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think it's also related to what Ivy was talking about, is that right now in most organizations, it's just kind of like one training for everyone, but there's no reason why it has to be. I mean, I guess there are logistical reasons why it's often like that, but like you can imagine having different trainings for people at different levels of organizations, different trainings for people based on how defensive we think that they might be. And sometimes it's like, it could be much less defensive provoking if maybe all the white men did training together or something. Maybe there are other reasons why you don't want that, but like, there are many potential ways or like interesting questions we could explore that I think we just need to do more experimentation on to see what we would find.
I could jump in. Oh, sorry. Oh, Ivy?
Oh, I was just going to say, I've sat in on lots of trainings as a person of color, and the message is we all are discriminating against people of color, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm actually a target of discrimination, and the trainings are not useful for me. A training for me might be, like, how do we cope with facing discrimination at work? How do I report discrimination at work? Things like that. And so tailoring, timely, thinking about what is the information that different types of people need, and this sort of top-down, we're intervening on discriminators or potential perpetrators can have issues. So I just wanted to reiterate, what Edward said.
Thanks, and then Hilary Onyeador.
Just very briefly, calling out the sort of that approach of tailoring interventions is what the PRISM team has done very effectively in terms of delivering different messaging to boys and girls. So, Emily and Steve Spencer and Wright would be well positioned to talk about the value of tailoring too.
Thank you, and we'll hear about that actually just after the break, so stay tuned. This is a question for everyone from Andy. His question is, might mixed findings on changing implicit bias be due to not doing enough for long periods of time? Are the interventions simply too brief?
Probably. I think that's right. I really find the bias of crowds work really interesting. So this is integrating a regional approach. And they've even tied percent or number of slaves in certain states to disparities in the present. So our 5-minute, 20-minute, 2-day, year even, if implicit biases are based in culture and built over years, these interventions may not be enough to disrupt them. And so when we think about what we need to do to change implicit biases, we're talking about wholesale societal change. If you're ready, let's anyway. And so I think we need to be realistic about that. And then that's part of why these organizational or structural interventions, changing the context, is so important, because we do have purchase over the context or the way that we set up decision making, things like that. and changing the culture more broadly. My colleague Tessa does work on cultural change over time and the relationship to biases, so she can talk about that maybe next conference or whatever. But I think that's a great point that, yeah, in order to change something like implicit bias, something bigger, more long-lasting, more consistent would need to happen.
Yeah, so there is an aspect of the paper that I presented that was kind of glossed over, which is like, we have evidence consistent with, so like, it is not a longitudinal intervention. That would have been great to test. It's just a one-off thing, but we kind of do have evidence because it is such a large sample and across so many different countries that we can kind of look at heterogeneity of where we think kind of people's baseline attitudes were prior to the training, and it does seem that kind of attitude changes concentrate amongst those people who have kind of less progressive attitudes to start with, and behavior changes among people who kind of have more progressive attitudes to start with. And if you assume that kind of attitude change is persistent, then it suggests that this might be like a multi-stage process where kind of first you kind of get people on board, like you educate them, and then they kind of develop better intentions, and then finally can kind of change behavior. I would say the data are consistent with that, but we don't have strong evidence that that's true. So I think that's optimistic. Like, yes, maybe it's just like more dosage, kind of more ambitious interventions. I think the more pessimistic side of me would say that beyond like implicit bias, like we have lots of like cognitive biases. If you think about like all of the behavioral econ work, it's just, there are lots of ways in which we are biased in our decision making. And in general, from that work, the research suggests that even educating people about biases, they still fall prey to them. Like, we can't kind of like educate our way out of not falling prey to like defaults or sunk cost fallacy or things like that. And so I think from that perspective, it makes me kind of less optimistic that it's just kind of a matter of dosage, because even in these things where people aren't defensive or they don't have any reason to want to perpetuate, I mean, like, yeah, there are lots of reasons why white people want to like perpetuate racism, great. But there's not like lots of reasons why people are like, yeah, we hate defaults, or I don't know. So like, but we don't see change in that by educating people. So that makes me a little more pessimistic about this just being a dosage issue.
Being ever the optimist, I really think change is possible, but I think you have to kind of look at what it is that you're doing. And I think that the key issue is not how long an intervention is, it's the degree to which you engage people in developing a meaningful understanding of the problem that they're going to be working on, and then equipping them, you know, to move forward in ways that, not that they get rid of implicit bias, but they detect the ways in which it creeps into their thinking and their behavior. So that detection process, I think, is critical, because, as I noted, that's a leverage point for taking action. And something that Edward just said, I think, is really important. And it may be that our windows for assessing the impact of interventions are way too short. When we start thinking about trying to affect change in these long-standing, in my vocabulary, habits of mind and the impact of those, it's going to take some time and some effort for people to work on those things. So being here makes me wish I was young again, because then I could start working on all of these other problems. But I leave it to all of you who are now taking the mantles that we hand down, whatever metaphor we want to use, and I'm excited to see what comes.
I don't know if the last person being cynical is like a thing, or if Sonia invented that. Earlier invented that. What I was going to say was just at least an insight from doing partnered research of the practical logistical constraints. That the more time, like many people would say, oh, this should be a full day workshop. You know, we got people for, 4 hours, and then, people would say, oh, this should go longer. But the actual difficulty of getting people to commit their time, I mean, even asking, the shortened project that we put out during the pandemic was only a 6-hour total ask across 6 months, and trying to get engineering faculty, with the dean of engineering cheering for us and doing everything she could do, was still like pulling teeth, herding cats, pick your favorite euphemism for doing something very difficult. So I think there is both this sort of fatigue where people think they've either already been trained, or that training never works, so why bother, or that even those who do want to, it's very hard to get like you can't put the people through like a university level course's worth of content on this topic in busy, high stakes professional settings a lot of times. So it really is a tough trade-off on sort of what to prioritize and how much you can reasonably pack in and still hope that people are taking something meaningful away that they can deploy and will actually change behavior.
And then I'll just add at the end here, I'm always shocked by how little you can actually cover when you're talking to real people outside of a classroom. So real people aren't just there to listen passively, they talk and they're engaged. And so you are really only able to cover usually like a third of what you think you're going to cover. So I think that's part of it as well. We have time for one last question. It's from Buju. And this is a question for Trish and Edward. So I like this because it's like a tete-a-tete. So it says, Trish, you're saying that, sorry, I won't read it like that. Okay, Trish, you're saying that bias awareness is not enough for change, whereas Edward, you're saying that making hiring managers aware increases hiring diversity. How might we reconcile these competing claims?
I don't think they were competing.
Oh.
So, Buju.
Okay.
I mean, part of what Edward said was not just to make them aware, but told them what to be thinking about. So gave them a way to approach it. So I don't know if it was a detailed, enumeration of the things, but it sounded to me, if I got it right, that you were making them aware and then helping them to have a plan for addressing the issues.
Yeah. So
I could say Trish. No.
Well, so this is me being the optimist, is that I actually genuinely do believe that most people want to make the right decision. And so that just I think if people were just to and this is the detection part, is just to think about, would I make a decision about who I'm going to hire or who I'm going to promote? Or if I'm going to make a decision in a more kind of everyday circumstance, like, who am I going to kind of invite out to lunch? If they just reframe that as like, this decision actually has consequences for equity in my organization, I think that could be positive. So like the new field experiment I'm talking about, it was only like a 5-minute video. It did not actually go into that much depth about how they should actually be thinking about the decision. We also ran a field experiment that was unfortunately a little bit underpowered, but where like the company, their normal promotions process was people get nominated, they have to write like a little blurb about why the person gets nominated. We randomly assign hiring managers to get an optional box that just said, write some words about how this person contributes to diversity. Again, it's totally optional. We don't tell them how to use it, it's not required. And that also actually increases the diversity of who gets promoted, just by making it like, okay, actually this decision, like I should be thinking about diversity. They don't have to fill in the box, but like it seems to prompt it. And so I think like in these situations, just like kind of raising the idea that this decision could have consequences for equity does seem to change people's behaviors. I don't know if this would be sustained, like if suddenly all of these suddenly every single time it says think about DEI, it's going to keep working, but at least now it seems that this is a potentially potent intervention that's really kind of light, and that's not being that prescriptive, and it's not trying to give people strategies, it's not trying to be like you're biased, it's just like maybe you should think about this. So I'm quite optimistic, but maybe in 5 years I'll be like, no, this was a terrible idea.
And then maybe to reconcile or talk, if you did that over and over, it might become a habit of mind. Thank you, everyone, for that. So thank you, Hilary, Trish, Edward, and Ivy. So we are ready for a break. We have more food outside. We love feeding people here. We're going to come back at 3:15 for our ESS showcase panel.
All right, I'll just say a few introductory remarks as people are coming back in to not take away the time. But, as I said this morning, it's really been an honor for me to have this leadership role for Engendering Success in STEM for the past 7 years. And I think one of the greatest privileges of that role has been to see some of the people, and you're just going to see a selection of them, some of the people who, when we first began in 2017 with this endeavor, who were still graduate students, and starting in on these projects and sort of seeing them be designed and developed and then carry through with them over time. And so I have a real sort of pleasure to introduce 4 of our younger scholars, I mean, younger than me, that's for sure, who have now all moved on to faculty positions or postdoc positions, after kind of really coming of age during these projects. So we have a panel of 4 speakers as part of this showcase of some of the findings and learnings that we've helped to co-create as part of this consortium. Each one of these talks represents the 4 different project teams that I mentioned at the start of the day. So first up, we'll have Antonia Gonzalez talking about the work that Project Climb has been doing. Antonia is now an associate professor, recently tenured, at Western Washington University. Dr. Emily Sear, who is just recently with the doctor moniker, having just defended her dissertation 2 weeks ago, I think. And Emily is now, well, she's listed here as University of Waterloo, but she is now at York University, correct? Doing a postdoc with Jennifer Steele. Then we'll have Dr. Francine Carmali presenting the work that Project SINC has done, and Francine is a postdoc at the University of Toronto. And last we'll have Will Hall, who started out at UBC, I think maybe was a postdoc with me finishing up when we first got this funding, and is now up for tenure this year at Brock University. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Antonia.
All right. Hello, everyone. So as they mentioned, I'm Dr. Antonia Gonzalez. I'm an associate professor at Western Washington University, and I'm one of the fellows on the ESS project. So I'm here representing our project team, Project Climb, and we explore the early developing roots of the gender disparity that we've been talking about, that we see in STEM across development. And these early biases can influence what courses or activities, or essentially what trajectory children choose to take, and also whether they're going to be successful in those courses or activities related to STEM. So our main research questions for this project that we've been doing over the past 6 years have been, firstly, when in development do stereotypes about gender and STEM emerge? Next is, do children's gender stereotypes affect their beliefs and behavior? Can we change children's gender stereotypes about STEM? And then also, can we increase STEM interest for girls and non-binary children? So our first research question focuses on how early in development children's gender stereotypes emerge. Sorry, I think I'm going to switch to this because I like to move around. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, perfect. So, oh, is it not on? Oh, here, sorry, my bad. Okay, now you can hear me. Is the volume okay? I'm not yelling, right? Okay, great. Okay, so previous research has demonstrated that children have a number of stereotypes related to science, technology, engineering, and math. So specifically, as early as age 6, children have stereotypes associating boys with math, robotics, computer science, and even brilliance. So for example, when children are asked who is more likely to be really, really smart, they're more likely to say boys. So while these concepts are all highly related to science, there had not necessarily been a direct test of children's implicit and explicit stereotypes about science. So this is important to understand since science is a distinct concept from math, and it's also one that children get a lot of exposure to through things like science toys and science museums. So it's a distinct concept, and we wanted to understand children's stereotypes about it. So we wanted to see whether, like other STEM stereotypes, gender stereotypes about science emerged by age 6.
So what we did was we developed a science gender implicit association test measuring how quickly children make automatic associations between gender and science versus reading. So we found that while children ages 6 through 10 said they liked science, said they were good at science, and explicitly said their own gender was better at science, implicitly, boys and girls associated men more with science and women more with reading. So this is suggesting that at a very early age, right when children are beginning elementary school, they are already implicitly associating science with boys. And this is similar to the developmental pattern that we see for gender stereotypes about math. And this all has very important potential implications for girls' interest and performance in science. In another study, we examined whether children have stereotypes about communal values or values that center care for and connection with others. You've heard a little bit about that today from other speakers. And research has shown that for many women, these communal values are important to their career goals. And one reason that women and girls might turn away from STEM careers is a lack of perceived fit in these careers. So generally, STEM careers tend to be less associated with communal values and are stereotyped to be more solitary careers. So as such, this is one reason women might turn away from STEM careers. So we wanted to understand the developmental origins of this issue by examining whether children have gender stereotypes about communal values. So what we did was we asked children ages 4 through 6 directly about who valued communion more, boys or girls. And we also asked them indirectly by presenting them with 2 different characters. One was a boy, one was a girl, and we wanted to know who they thought sort of was more likely to engage in a communal behavior. And we found, again, by age 6, both boys and girls believe that girls value communion more. So both boys and girls were demonstrating this stereotype. And so again, these stereotypes have very important implications for children's perceived fit in STEM. And so particularly for communally oriented children, they might actually start to steer away from these careers as soon as they start to learn stereotypes associated with STEM. Our second research question was how children's stereotypes affect their beliefs and behaviors. So previous research, again, that was talked about today, has shown that in adult women, stereotypes about math and gender are linked to a number of outcomes, such as impaired math performance, lower math engagement. We also see, even as early as with young girls, that these stereotypes are linked to decreased interest, belonging, and motivation in STEM fields. And there's some mixed evidence that young girls' performance can also be negatively affected by these stereotypes. So we conducted a study looking at how children's gender stereotypes about math might influence their performance on a math-related task. So this task is called Panamath, and it measures children's approximate number system, which I won't go into too much detail, but it's essentially your number sense, right? A core cognitive capacity that is associated with later math skills. And it's age-adjusted, so this test can actually be conducted as early as infancy. So we found that when told that the test was a test of gender differences in math, children who associated, or specifically girls who associated boys more with math, did worse on the task than girls who had weaker stereotypes. And we saw this as young as ages 3 to 4. And this relationship did not exist for boys, and it also did not exist for girls when we told them it was a test of gender differences in eyesight. So it was specific to a math test context. And it suggests that for girls with gender stereotypes, this particular context might negatively influence performance on math-related tasks as early as preschool. So our third research question focused on how do we change this, right? How do we change the stereotypes that may underlie some of these negative effects? So as these stereotypes emerge early in development, they can clearly impact math-related performance as well as a variety of other issues that impact interest in STEM. There are also numerous studies with adults suggesting that exposure to counter-stereotypical exemplars is an effective method of bias change. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to investigate whether this would be the case with children. So while previous research has shown that counter-stereotypical exemplars can reduce bias in children in the domain of racial bias, we wanted to see if this was also the case for gender stereotypes. So we decided to examine whether exposure to counter-stereotypical exemplars could change 7 to 10-year-old children's gender stereotypes about math. And we found that when children heard about girls who were good at math and boys who were good at reading, they no longer demonstrated an implicit stereotype associating boys with math. In contrast, when we presented them with a control condition where they were told about boys and girls being good at swimming and tennis, we saw that they did have a significant stereotype. So these results suggest that this method could be effective in changing young girls' stereotypes about STEM. Again, it follows suit with some of the other research that's been discussed today and the importance of having role models. So in future work, we would want to see whether these effects last long term, and then also whether it can extend to other STEM domains, not just math. And so lastly, we are also interested in understanding strategies to increase STEM interest for girls and non-binary children. So in our past research, we have mostly included boys and girls in the sample, but it's also important to note that non-binary and gender diverse children may also be steered away from STEM at a young age. So like girls, there may be a perceived lack of fit as well as an influence of stereotypes that associate STEM with boys and men. So there are a number of important strategies that we can look at from existing literature. Again, many of the things that were presented today that we can draw from to think about best practices to increase STEM interest and engagement. So firstly, consistent with our own research, other studies have shown that exposing children to gender-matched role models in STEM can affect stereotypes. So we have sort of follow-up work that confirms that this is probably going to be good to do with children. Then there's also research showing that positive STEM experiences can have an important influence. So for example, early experiences with robotics can potentially increase girls' interests. There's also research demonstrating that simply explaining the value of math in everyday life can actually increase engagement in STEM. And then also avoiding gendered language and using inclusive language that focuses more on the action rather than the identity. So for example, using inclusive language like saying doing science rather than being a scientist. So what we're currently working on is following up on some of the work on communal values. And so as mentioned, a perception of STEM as a non-communal activity might lead children who value communion, particularly girls, away from STEM. So a couple of the projects that are ongoing for Project Climb are that we are currently conducting a text analysis of STEM camps and programs with public messaging to look at communal versus agentic messaging, how that might have an influence on interest in these programs, as well as presenting children with STEM activities and framing them as having more communal goals to try and increase interest in STEM for communally oriented children. And so we're hoping to have more exciting results on this in the near future. So that's just a bit of an overview. There's a lot more going on with Climb, but this is, I just wanted to share these exciting results over the past 6 years. Everyone's worked so hard on this project. A huge thank you to everyone who's involved with it, our past and present research assistants and lab managers, and of course, Science World. They have been such a huge partner in this, and we absolutely could not have done this research without them. So thanks, everyone.
I'll give it a go. I'm not sure if I've used a handheld microphone before, but we'll see how this goes. I'm worried I'm going to try to click forward the slides using the microphone, so we'll just see. So I'm here today representing Project PRISM, huge team. I have probably missed a name or two, but we are a really large group, and I just want to acknowledge this was a huge team effort. And also a big thank you to our organizational partner, I'm not sure if I see Virginia in the room today, but hopefully somewhere she hears us saying thank you. So Project PRISM is focused on sort of the middle school age range here, so just after Project Climb from a developmental perspective, and that's around grades 6 to 8. And the key thing that we were focused on in, figuring out what we wanted to do as part of Project PRISM is that there are minimal or non-existent gender gaps in STEM potential. So as was already mentioned, per the vast majority of tests at this age range, we're not seeing evidence of math, science, etc. ability differences. And in fact, some researchers even find a reversal where girls are outperforming boys on some indicators of math potential. But we see this huge drop-off in gender participation. So why are we seeing these bottlenecks for girls? Why are we seeing this decoupling of a lack of potential gender gap or gender gap in terms of STEM potential, but then these huge decrements in terms of participation? We designed 2 interventions to address this kind of paradox here, which are focused in on late childhood through to early adolescence. And I'll be talking about Project 1 today, which is providing direct support to improve girls' sense of identity fit in STEM. And Project 2, addressing the environment. So very much in line with many of the conversations we've already had today. And that one's focused on reducing boys' stereotyping of ability in this domain. Of course, these 2 were in the same space. So Project 3, which for those of you who are sticking around tomorrow, I'll be talking a little bit about Project 3, which is the connection between these 2. So as I already mentioned, we partnered with Actua. They are, I believe, Canada's largest nonprofit in the STEM educational space. And they act as kind of an umbrella organization pulling together a number of STEM-focused camps at universities and colleges across Canada. The camps that we partnered with had 16 to 34 boys and girls per camp, and the majority are about 11 to 13 years old. And boys and girls who participated in Project PRISM were randomly assigned to either an intervention or a control, controls being just empty controls, an intervention targeted towards girls' experiences, and an intervention targeted towards boys' experiences. Today, I'm just going to be talking about Wave 3 for girls, so that's our cell size. We adjusted the intervention from year to year just as we gained more information and we chatted a little bit more with our organizational partners, but I'll be collapsing data across 3 years of collection for boys. Okay. So Project 1, the PRISM Girls paper. If you have any feedback, now's the time. We're submitting soon. So if you have any advice on this framing, definitely we have time to integrate it. So just to zoom back out to the SAFE model, I'm sure most of the folks in the room are familiar with this. Tracing from person-environment fit, or the extent to which self-concepts align with perceptions of the environment, that's translating into feelings of fluency in that specific social environment, a sense of state authenticity, then translates into career trajectories. So we can see, especially largely adult samples, that women who report feeling a low sense of person-environment fit in STEM are less likely to enter STEM, and if they are already in a STEM domain, they're more likely to exit. So focusing in on just these 2 kind of bookends to this model, we thought girls who are seeing maybe no differences in ability based on gender in their age range, and especially girls who've chosen to go to a STEM summer camp and spend a whole week of their summer focused on science and math and physics and what have you, maybe they feel a pretty good sense of fit right now, especially this population. Maybe they think they do have a good sense of congruence between their sense of identity and their conceptualization of STEM. But when they think about the future, are they forecasting a decreasing sense of fit in STEM? So when they think about their possible future selves, are they making predictions that are in line with the kind of cross-sectional decrements in participation that we observe over the life course? So in other words, maybe girls in STEM camps feel pretty good about their sense of fit right now, but they're less certain about how they're going to fit in the future. So to that aim, we designed an intervention helping girls focus on their future fit. So in-person STEM role model, most of which were camp counselors at these STEM camps, guided girls through a semi-structured conversation, first showing girls how they can achieve their values through the STEM domain. This is tailored to girls' top-rated values that we gathered on a pre-screen. And I'll just note here that for 82% of the girls, this conversation was around how you can connect to your top-rated value of family by going into STEM, so a very communally oriented value. Then they watched a video of several young adult role models, male and female, all of whom were real STEM undergraduate students. Thank you to Steve for making this video, where they also were largely discussing a fairly communal orientation within STEM, how they're really excited to go into a STEM career and how that ties back to their largely communal values, as I mentioned. And then the in-person STEM role model gave a message of double inclusion. So I'm not sure if I see Sapna here, but sort of the inverse of some of the concerns that are mentioned by women in STEM, whereby they feel they're excluded both by their predominantly male colleagues in STEM, but also by the women outside of STEM, so feeling like they're doubly excluded. Instead, we gave a message of double inclusion. So the in-person STEM role model, almost all women, gave a personal anecdote of a time that they felt they were they felt a sense of personal inclusion by peers in STEM and friends outside of STEM. Okay, so 2 key measures, STEM fit, so how much do you feel like you would belong in an engineering major? That's our forecasted sense of future fit. That's our key outcome measure here in terms of fit. And then their interest in STEM high school courses and careers. And we see that our intervention was associated with a boost in forecasted fit in STEM. We measured it twice during the week, once on Wednesday, once on Friday, as well as a boost in their interest in taking STEM high school classes and interest in STEM careers. But notably, this is the top violin up there. We didn't see a boost in their sense of current fit, which you'll note is also higher than their sense of forecasted fit. So in other words, our intervention was really localized to girls' sense of future fit. We helped them see an adult self that might fit into adult STEM environments, but we didn't see any movement vis-a-vis their current sense of fit. And there's a mediational model that I will skip past because I just noticed the timer down there. So in summary, the project 1, the girls' intervention, led to an increase in girls' forecasted fit in STEM, which cascades into increased interest in STEM high school courses and careers. So project 2, this was just published, I guess about a month ago in Child Development. This is focused on the boys that we recruited as part of the sample. The purpose of this project was to convince boys to see girls' ability in STEM, their latent ability in STEM. So as I already mentioned, girls' math and science aligns with boys at this age range, but is often underestimated and underappreciated, even by girls themselves. So we designed a persuasive appeal intervention based on some past work, again by Steve, to convince boys that girls my age are good at math, science, and computers, these 3 averaged together as our key outcome metric. This had a very similar structure to the girls' intervention, where an in-person STEM role model, here male, first gave boys a value affirmation to facilitate open-mindedness, and then gave them a direct data-driven persuasive appeal regarding girls' ability in STEM commonly being undervalued because of pervasive societal stereotypes, and it was phrased in a very kid-friendly way using an illustrative metaphor. And then it was personalized by the in-person role model giving a personal anecdote of a time that they had underestimated a female peer's ability in STEM. And again, worked out. So the intervention improved boys' perceptions of girls' STEM ability, and again, this was highly specific. So this didn't move around boys' perceptions of boys' STEM ability. It didn't move around boys' perceptions of girls' English ability. It was really specifically localized on our measure of interest. And we also saw a stronger effect amongst the younger boys. So this is around age 10 to 11. We see a really strong intervention effect that's almost bringing younger boys up to the level of boys who are a little bit older in our sample. But also importantly, no backlash seen across this age continuum. Okay, so the last measure I'm going to be talking about today is a network measure. So all of the kids in the camps, boys and girls, were given a full list of all of the campers, not just participants, and they dragged each name into one of these 4 buckets. I then collapsed best friends or friends into an outgoing tie. So this counts as a friendship nomination, whereby if I drag your name into a best friend or a friend but not my best friend bucket, that's counting as an outgoing tie from me to you. Now, a quick summary of gender centrality, which is the number of nominations that each person received from either same or cross-gender peers as a function of how many they could have received. So smaller camps, you're divided by that smaller number of potential nominations. And to summarize those effects, perceptions of girls' STEM ability were associated with boys receiving more nominations from their female peers. So boys who had more positive beliefs about girls' ability in STEM ended up being nominated as a friend by more of the girls in their camp. So an indication there that maybe boys are treating girls a little bit differently as a result of our intervention. I will note we didn't see a direct effect from the boys' intervention to girls' friendship nominations, but I think this is a fairly compelling kind of cascade between perceptions of girls' STEM ability and then these nominations, which are from girls. And I'll just note, the girls, of course, didn't know which condition the boys were in. So there is something, there's something to be said here. So as I mentioned in the beginning, Project 1 focused on improving girls' sense of future fit and interest in STEM, check mark, hopefully. And Project 2, reducing boys' stereotyping of girls' STEM ability. And Project 3, connecting the two. So my real interest, I'm a network scientist, is on these cross-gender friendships. So the extent to which the social environment, which we've hopefully improved as a result of this boys' intervention, then feeds into the sense of future fit and interest amongst their female peers carried by these cross-gender friendships. So if you're around tomorrow morning, we'll be talking some more about this. And again, thank you to everyone who made this project possible.
Just as a reminder, as Francine's coming up, that feel free to put questions in the slide for
All right. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Francine, and today I get the honor of talking about Project SINC and what we've been up to and what we're planning moving forward. So at SINC, which stands for Shaping Inclusive Network Cultures, our focus is at the university stage. So this is when women have made it in the sense that they've decided to become STEM professionals. But at this stage, so the problem really is less about bringing women into STEM, but rather keeping them there. And indeed, research shows, and as you've heard today already, that when compared to men, women leave their STEM professions at significantly higher rates and are less likely to be promoted. So at SINC, we believe that one important factor impacting women's retention and promotion is their experiences navigating negative social interactions while doing STEM. And so our goals at SINC is really to center around promoting the meaningful integration of people of all genders while doing STEM. But SINC is not only interested in interaction experiences. We believe that retention and promotion issues are also rooted in structural problems like poor policies. So SINC has also done work examining that. And finally, SINC also focuses on improving the system of doing research through developing advanced tools and training. So first, the projects that aim to better understand the interactions that women experience, we ask first, what are STEM students' first workplace interactions like? Also, what are STEM students' experiences like while they're doing course teamwork? How are their interactions impacting their identity development? And how do their interactions with others around task assignment impact them? So to understand first workplace experiences, we recruited STEM students who were currently in their very first STEM-related co-op, also known as an internship or a work placement. And this project was led by myself, Will, Liz, and Kim. And our goal here was really just to determine what kinds of interactions women were having during their very first experiences with being a professional in their field. Do they feel respected? Do they feel valued, accepted? So results here unfortunately revealed that when women had interactions with other men where they felt a low sense of acceptance and respect, they also had higher feelings of social identity threat. And I won't bother defining that because I think we all heard already a lot about that. And also what we found was that identity threat had some psychological costs, right? So higher identity threat was associated with higher feelings of burnout. And it also had cognitive costs. So it was negatively impacting actual performance of women on a working memory task. So in the future, we are examining specifically what within these negative interactions are cueing a lack of acceptance and respect for women. And we'll focus on cues such as nonverbal behaviors. And we've also begun analyzing a separate study focusing on nonverbal behaviors and whether they can mitigate stereotypes during diverse group interactions. And in this work, we're really interested in that intersection between gender and race in interpreting nonverbal behaviors in working groups. Okay, so next we aim to understand the dynamics in courses where students form teams or course projects. So in this work called SMITE, which stands for Studying Marginalized Individuals' Teamwork Experiences, this is led by Jackie, Emily, Kim, and Liz. And here they collected data during an 8-month long project-based engineering course. And what they did was they measured psychological measures like feelings of identity threat and burnout, but also team members' social networks were measured, and even their physiological responses while they're working in these team groups. And all of this data is going to help us understand the conditions under which stress can form in these teamwork scenarios and how that stress might impair successful team collaborations. So because addressing interactions or interaction issues in university could really set up students for better interactions in their future jobs, this could be a really great point in the pipeline for intervention. So in the future, we want to test interventions that promote women's feeling of fit in this context and reduce stress during these teamwork scenarios. So next, we consider that university students are budding professionals, right? They're starting to build their professional identities. So to examine this process, we ran a focus group study with engineering students at the University of Toronto. So this project was led by Will, Joyce, Sonia, Jackie, and Liz. And results here show that both men and women in universities start developing their new professional identities, so in this case as engineers. But unfortunately, this kind of identity developed out of a shared experience of a culture of suffering. And also, unfortunately, and concerningly, this identity was protected and tied to bias denial. So what we saw was that a stronger engineering identity was associated with greater denial of gender bias in engineering. So for future work here, we really want to focus on how to support students' development into their professional identities without sacrificing the critical lens of that identity. Okay, so we're also looking at identity switching, which is when people purposely change parts of their social identity to fit into the workplace, like maybe changing their hairstyle, for example. And these kind of consistent impression management behaviors can be really costly, not only because they're exhausting, but they can lead to feelings of inauthenticity, and also burnout, and ultimately negative job performance. So this work is led by Alice and Sonia, who are currently running a study examining the cues that initiate identity shifting among Black Canadians at work. And ultimately, we hope to craft interventions aimed at reducing the signals that marginalized individuals need to change themselves to fit in. Okay, and finally, we have also examined tasks that university STEM students in their workplace, but also during their coursework, what kind of tasks do they want to be doing, and whether they're actually doing those tasks. So this project is led by Will, Jackie, Liz, and myself. And preliminary results here show that both men and women in STEM expect that more time that they spend doing these technical versus social tasks will bring more meaningfulness and happiness to them. So our next question, though, is whether women are actually assigned more social or menial tasks when compared to men, which could be an important signal of poor organizational inclusivity for women. Okay, so SINC has also been thinking about policies. So specifically promotion policies, diversity policies, and policies around diversity training. So since we see increasing gender disparities the higher up the professional ladder that we climb, really thinking about barriers to promotions makes a lot of sense. And this is exactly what Joyce and Sonia did in their work related to opt-in versus opt-out policies for entering competitions in the workplace, like promotions, or even academic competitions like awards. Here they are. And results show that although women were less likely to opt into competitions when compared to men's rates of entering those competitions, when that opt-in policy was changed to an opt-out model, which means that everybody's automatically entered into the competition and you have to opt out if you don't want to compete, we see in that scenario, gender differences are eliminated. So women are not more likely to opt out than men. So this award-winning work is actually a great example of why research on policy implications is so important, because it can be a route to a more immediate impact, right? So changing opt-in to opt-out policies is much easier to implement. We also have work on diversity policies and procedures. For example, a project led by Grusha, Sonia, and Joyce examines formal disclosure of social identity at work and whether there's a mismatch between labels used by the by the organizations in their forms and how employees actually define their own identity, and that this mismatch might lead to negative outcomes like lower feelings of authenticity and a lower desire just to engage in that formal disclosure process. So institutions' attention to disclosure processes and the labels that they use could be an important, again, cue for inclusiveness for employees and even students. So other work led by Angie and Sonia examines corporate diversity training to uncover effective and sustainable designs and deliveries and evaluations. So Angie and Sonia have been working with corporations to test diversity training techniques that are incorporated within leadership training with content such as responsible leadership and corporate responsibilities. Okay, so last but certainly not least, at SINC, we're creating tools and training for researchers. So one training program is called Canada's SROP, or Summer Research Program Opportunity. And this is founded by Liz and led with Chanel. And this is an 8-week program that recruits BIPOC undergraduates interested in applying to graduate school in psychology, management, or neuroscience. And they participate full-time in activities such as professional development workshops, grad application prep sessions, networking. But centrally, each student is matched with a faculty member to complete a research project in their lab. So these students gain an incredible amount of research experience perfect for their grad applications. The program has already attracted over 30 faculty members, 45 BIPOC undergraduates have already completed the program, and it's received funding from over 10 departments, research institutes, and administrations from the University of Toronto. And Liz is working really hard to make this a Canada-wide program, and I'm confident she will. Another amazing program is QuantTide. So this is also founded by Liz and led with the help of Louisa and Rizik. And QuantTide is a 5-day training program for grad students in engineering or social sciences. And it's open to students with intersecting underrepresented identities in Canadian STEM. And the first 3 days of are workshops where students learn unique advanced statistical methods. And then the last 2 days are grant writing workshops where students propose research incorporating one of the stats methods that they learned about previously. So SINC has also been creating research tools. Specifically, Liz and Dr. Sabrina Tai at Brock University have created Experience Sampler app. And this is an app where researchers can send surveys and tasks to their participants through their phone throughout the day. And this allows researchers to collect in-the-moment responses. Jackie and Liz have also done work testing appropriate physiological measures and tools for field research, and so that we can really go beyond self-report measurements to help us understand students' responses and their experiences, especially responses indicating stress. Okay, so to wrap up, which I probably should have done a little bit ago, but it's clear from all of this research that navigating interactions while doing STEM can be challenging for women in university. So whether in class or at work, interventions that improve the dynamics during which these interactions happen will be important for women's future in STEM. And as we continue interaction research, it's also important to work on finding the best policies for our institutions, as well as training and tools for our research. So Tony and Will and other ESS members have written a lot about recommendations for creating more inclusive cultures, and our data really highlights that we need to double down on those. And I was gonna chat about a couple of them, but I'll skip that. And thank this amazing team of researchers. This is SINC, and we've done, I think, amazing work. And that work wouldn't have been possible without all these partners, so we send a big thanks to them. And thank you all for your attention.
All right, I'm super excited to be here today to share with you some of the work that RISE has been doing over the last 7 years. Before I do that, I want to highlight the amazing people that have been involved in this project. So none of what RISE has accomplished would have been possible without this fantastic team of professors, postdocs, graduate students, undergrads, and of course the industry partners. All led by Tony Schmader, who brought us all together to do this work. The goal of Project RISE was to try and translate research on implicit bias and social identity threats into practical solutions for fostering greater gender inclusion in STEM workplaces. This has involved different members of our research team spearheading a set of interrelated projects, including research on social identity threat in the workplace, the nature of implicit bias and its effects, the environmental cues to fit and inclusion, and the barriers and benefits to allyship. And it's my great pleasure to be here today to share with you some of the highlights from these various different research streams and how we then pulled them together to inform the evidence-based training method that Hilary summarized earlier. So one of the first goals of RISE was to try and understand the nature of the interpersonal context in STEM workplaces. So Francine actually nicely summarized some work looking at the interpersonal context for co-op students. But before we did that work, we actually did research exploring men and women's interactions that they were having in professional engineering companies. So we analyzed in this series of studies, we analyzed data from several hundred professional engineers, and a couple of interesting things came out in these analyses. First, for women, on days where they experienced a high level of social identity threat, they also reported being more burned out at work. Second, the experience of social identity threat for women was predicted by negative interpersonal interactions that they were having with men at work. So women reported experiencing high levels of social identity threat on days where their interactions with their male colleagues elicited a lack of acceptance and respect. And then that social identity threat translates into feeling more burned out on that day at work. So this was some of the first evidence that RISE had collected, documenting the unique challenges associated with the interpersonal context of STEM workplaces. Building from this work, our next set of studies set out to try and understand how implicit stereotypes might lead to less supportive interactions between men and women in STEM organizations. And Emily's PNAS paper is a great example of this. So in a study of over 1,200 STEM employees, Emily was able to look at how men's and women's implicit gender stereotypes are linked to the way they relate to one another in the workplace. And what she found is that men with a stronger implicit tendency to think STEM, think men, reported socializing less often with their female colleagues, And Emily was able to show that with using social network analysis. And women did not show the same kind of biased behaviors towards men in the workplace. Emily was also able to look at the consequences for women who had fewer social ties from men in their organization. And what she found is that women reporting fewer social ties from men also reported having higher levels of social identity threat. They felt lower social fit, and they reported lower workplace engagement. Bringing together and synthesizing a lot of the ideas from our empirical work, Tony developed a theoretical framework for how environments can signal or fail to signal inclusion. And Tony's published several papers on this model now, referred to as the SAFE model at point today. And a notable example of this work is her annual review paper, in which she explores how the SAFE model can be applied to STEM contexts. So this model assumes that people's attraction and engagement in STEM is going to be a function of their ability to feel authentic while they're working in STEM. So according to Tony's model, our ability to feel authentic in a workplace, say, is going to be somewhat contingent upon the personal characteristics that we bring to work, but more importantly, it's going to also be about what the environment signals to us in terms of three distinct types of fit. What Tony argues in this paper is that the prevalent gender stereotypes that exist in STEM can lead women to encounter signals in their environment to suggest that this place is not going to be a good fit for who they are, which is we call a lack of self-concept fit, that the institution itself doesn't support the goals that they might have, this is a lack of goal fit, and that people in the organization or the institution won't accept them for what they can contribute, or a lack of social fit. So this model is being used to better understand the distinct ways in which STEM and the STEM environment can fail to, or can in fact, signal fit and authenticity and belonging for folks who are marginalized in those spaces. In search for some possible solutions to these challenges of fit, members of our research team have also been interested in developing the concept of allyship, which is defined as the practice of taking action to support those who are marginalized. Lucy D'Souza, who just defended her dissertation last week, has done some research on the barriers to allyship. And in Lucy's dissertation, she developed a theoretical model in which she proposes that allyship can take the form of proactive efforts to foster inclusion, but allyship can also be reactive, and it can be reactive actions to counteract bias when it happens. In addition, Lucy proposes that either type of allyship, proactive or reactive, can be directed at oneself, the interpersonal context, and the institution or organization that you're part of. Finally, our team has imported the psychological insights from these 4 topics, so social identity threat, implicit bias, fit and inclusion, and allyship, into the training methods that Hilary spoke about earlier. So Hilary has really led the way in assessing whether an evidence-based inclusion training can be an effective way of changing beliefs and behavior in STEM workplaces. As you heard Hilary summarize, this work has focused on the benefits of men's allyship for fostering a sense of inclusion for women. And across 2 experimental studies, the inclusion training has shown some evidence to change people's beliefs that bias is a problem, and it shows some evidence of increasing motivation and efficacy to engage in allyship actions. So a lot of the findings I just described are sort of hot off the presses, but you can find early reports of Project RISE's work on our Success in STEM website, which is on the screen. I also have another exciting thing to share. We're unveiling a new allyship simulator, which people can link to from our website, and there's a QR code on the screen here. We used a streamlined version of this simulator in our workshop that Hilary summarized earlier to demonstrate how just having a few people in your organization acting as allies can counteract bias and foster greater inclusion. Finally, I want to give a shout out to key team members who have received training from Project RISE. So these include nearly half a dozen newly minted PhD students, and 4 postdocs, including myself, who have received training from RISE, as well as several PhD students who are currently getting trained by RISE. And of course, I want to give a special thanks to our industry partners, our partnering organizations who we've worked closely with over the last 7 years to aid in recruitment, data collection, and knowledge translation efforts. We could not have done, none of this work would have happened without you all. So thank you for your support and engagement, and thank you for listening.
Don't worry, my final closing remarks aren't going to take that long, so I'm shaving into some of my time. But thank you guys so much for joining us here today and sharing your work. We also have more questions than we can possibly address, so I'll try to kind of synthesize a few things. So first, let me talk a little bit more about, let me start with a little bit more about the developmental work. So one question that I think was raised to you, Emily, but I'll ask others to kind of chime in with this too, is more about the idea of backlash among boys who were, persuaded that girls have equal STEM ability. Do you see any possible risk, and maybe this is true for any of the work you guys have been involved with on interventions, any possible risk of that backlash, or even with younger kids, seeing it in the form of bullying?
Yeah, so we also asked boys, how good do you think boys are at math, science, and computers? And as is in our paper, we did shrink the difference between boys' perceptions of girls' STEM ability and boys' perceptions of boys' STEM ability, but we're not at parity. So I would love to say that our intervention got us right up to boys thinking that girls and boys are equivalently good at STEM, and we got closer. We're not quite there. So I'm not really sure what an intervention would look like where we would see that kind of backlash, where we're overshooting boys' perceptions of their own in-group STEM ability. It's possible. I think I saw that question in the app, that maybe they could see girls as rivals. I don't think it's plausible in this setting, but maybe a really supercharged intervention, a hypothetical one someday, but.
Yeah, I'll just note for our counter-stereotypical exemplar intervention, we did not see gender differences. We saw that decrease in stereotypes happened for both boys and girls. We also have a younger age group with that, 7 to 10-year-olds. So, I mean, I am not necessarily basing this on strong evidence, but I think that there's a possibility that the younger that we intervene, the less chance there is of that backlash, right? If it becomes normalized from a young age, then maybe we have a better chance of not having that. But again, an empirical question to be tested.
Just on the topic of backlash, Francine or Will, and any of the work that you've been involved with either in SINC or RISE, do you have any comments on backlash as something you've seen? I know, for example, Francine, Project SINC has done some more qualitative work that you referred to. Did anything about backlash come up in that work?
So some of that qualitative work, Will might know a little bit more about that. Yeah, I will say that I can think of, in terms of intervention for boys or men, like I think that this is something still we need to be thinking about at the university level. Yeah, that it's still like, when we're thinking about these kind of interactions between men and women, and I think kind of focusing also on interventions for men at this stage, and definitely these kind of implicit biases are still we're seeing those kind of, I think, driving these kind of more negative interactions in terms of like nonverbal behaviors and things like that. So I think this would also be a great place to think about how we can intervene, in terms of men and their interactions with women, even at the university stage.
Yeah, and in the qualitative work, we did see some evidence of backlash. So that was with engineering undergraduate students, and there was definitely a sense from the men that there's too much attention being paid to bringing women into engineering, and there's a little bit of feeling that men were now at a disadvantage when getting co-op positions. So that certainly came up in the qualitative interviews.
Any ideas on how to mitigate that? I know one of the other themes that comes up, obviously, given some of the work that was talked about, was allyship. Does empowering men or anyone really to be allies help mitigate that backlash, do you think?
I mean, I think things like avoiding zero-sum framings and things like that there's some evidence suggesting that tends to be a good idea.
That's great. And so I pivoted to allyship, and I want to kind of ask all of you to kind of think about, but let me start with the younger age groups, because like Antonia, you talked about some of the work on communal stereotypes. Do you see, or have you talked in Project Climb at all about linkages between thinking of that, what it means to be kind and caring, and boys accepting that stereotype, and then linking that to like Project PRISM's work on then, setting the early roots for what it is to be an ally that might take people into adulthood?
Yeah, so with our project investigating children's stereotypes about communal values, we actually found that their 4 to 5-year-old children did not seem to hold that stereotype. It was age 6 and up. So this, and I think some of that has to do with an early emphasis on simply instilling morals into children, right? Like emphasis on being caring, kind, think about preschools and sort of that emphasis. And then we start to see the gender difference emerge around age 6, entering elementary school. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I think that it does seem to be, there's evidence, of course, we also look at cross-cultural work and we see that this is, a learned sort of stereotype. And so, hopefully does that answer it?
Yeah, well, I mean, Emily, what are your thoughts on that? Because in some sense, the retraining the boys' attitudes, does that seem like it sets the groundwork for allyship?
Yeah, I would hope so. We don't have an amazing measure in PRISM, but I think I also saw this question in the app that do the boys who have more positive beliefs about girls' STEM ability, are they then turning around and nominating more girls as friends? And we actually don't see that. So the boys who have more positive beliefs about girl STEM ability, they're more likely to be nominated as a friend by the girls. So the girls are including those boys more often, but the boys aren't necessarily reaching out to forge friendships with girls to the same degree. So I don't know if PRISM was maybe the right way to look at that specific measure, but we do see a distinction there in who is forming these friendships. But I think that's just as good, right? Girls including those boys who have more positive beliefs. The only other thing I have on communal values is we had boys rate their top rated value too, and we didn't see any gender differences there. So boys and girls were most likely to report family and friends as their most important value. So in that sense, we're not quite seeing the emergence of self-reported most important values at that age, but it'd be interesting to see how that progresses.
Let me switch gears to Francine. There's a question, and I know this is Joyce's work. You were kind of summarizing in the broader scheme of things, but to the degree you can answer this. Glenn asked about the opt-in and opt-out work and how cool that is, and wonders, though, if men tend to do practice more over-claiming. Are they, what's the role of kind of the opt-in out? Sorry, let me just say the question. Is the implementation of an opt-in policy equivalent to the imposition of a problematic male default standard?
Yeah. So I was thinking, I was thinking about this kind of idea of, I think there's even research to show that, like, even applying for a job, right, like men are more likely to do that, even if they don't have the qualifications. So I definitely think this is connected, where there's this kind of more, this is part of their defaults, it's part of this risk-ready socialization to be more competitive, to be more ready to set in and compete, and that could be that could be a male default for sure, I think.
Maybe I'll cap us off, and I'll start with you, Will, since kind of going back and forth a bit. But this is sort of a question more for me, but I'm just curious, since the four of you have really been with ESS since its inception. So I'm curious to sort of hear your broad personal take on just, what you've learned through kind of doing this partnered research, because I think it's something really rare to do pretty early in your career, and wonder how you feel like it's maybe changed the way you think about your own research and your career trajectory. And so that's a hard question, I know, but I'm going to start with Will, because he's been doing this a long time.
I think what I've learned is just the value of collaborators and having people, like you mentioned, Elizabeth Croft at the start of this. I mean, she was a real champion of this work, and she, my memory of the kind of genesis of that is sort of we emailed her to ask if we could recruit her grad students for a project. We wanted them to come in the lab and do like a fast friends procedure, and she's like, well, that sounds cool, but I actually have access to all these engineering companies, and how about you come work together and do that? So, and that is set.
And she had money to fund you.
She had money as well, and that set this whole thing, this whole chain reaction off. And so just the value of having collaborators who will champion and open doors for you is huge.
That's great.
Okay, I feel like I've learned so much from working with ESS, and definitely changed my way of thinking. I feel like I haven't started quite right at the beginning of ESS, but I came in early, and one of the first conference I went to was the one in Waterloo, and I remember just being shocked by listening to what the partners wanted from us, which was evidence that bias existed. And I was like, what? Don't we already know that? You know what I mean? So I think what really struck me was just the disconnect between what was happening in academia and what was going on in the real world. And so for me, my perspective in terms of research has really, I think, switched to be much more problem focused than it ever was. And it's something I really value from what I got with my work here.
Yeah, so I've been, so Andy built this partnership with Science World before I even came to UBC, and just having them as collaborators in this I just can't understate it. I'm currently at an institution where I just constantly miss Science World, and I miss working with them and doing research there. So yeah, I mean, they've had incredible input in terms of, they are running those science activities. They've brought our attention to issues that they've run into in their own sort of attempts to recruit more girls to these science programs. So it's been an amazing partnership. And yeah, again, I miss Science World all the time. So.
Yeah, so I started my MA right when this consortium started. So it's all I've ever known, really, and it's been awesome. But I also know it's been an incredible privilege to work with the partners, as the other people have said. So every year I've gone to ACTUA's national conference as well, and they ask such different questions than what you get, at SPSP or something like that. You get these really, really practical questions about application in a way that I wouldn't necessarily have always considered in just a very practical, pragmatic perspective. And I have so appreciated that. And they've given us absolutely critical insights in adjusting our interventions from year to year that I'm not sure if we would have come to maybe as quickly without having that real boots on the ground experience. They really helped us with even just at the level of the language of how we're explaining these really tough concepts to kids. So that's been incredibly helpful, just to be able to sort of peek my head out of our little academic silo and see, okay, this is how we're actually impacting the real world and how the real world is feeding back into our theories and our methods. So that's been incredible and my favorite part.
That's great. Thank you guys so much for your perspectives. I know many people had questions we didn't get a chance to cover, but the good news is after I say 5 minutes of things, you get to go to the reception and tag people to have conversations. So thank you so much, Shelby. So let's see if I can get us back on track. Okay, so just a few closing remarks as we end out the day, and mainly I just want to give a bunch of thank yous to a bunch of people. So first, I just want to thank all of our invited speakers that you heard from today. I know it's such an invigorating experience to see so much thought and wisdom go into this set of talks, and thank you so much to everyone who traveled here to be part of the day and share your work with us. I also want to give a big thank you to several key people, as well as behind the scenes kind of organizations. First of all, I want to ask you all to give just a huge round of applause for Trish Smith and Alice Cho, who are here somewhere. I mean, really, ESS is not an organization without Trish, who started out being my next door neighbor, and we became friends. And then I recruited her to be our project manager many years ago, and she's just been fantastic. And Alice here at University of Toronto has been so key in making today's event the success it has been. And I also want to give a shout out to others who provided support, Andy Barron, Chanel Hines, and Sonia. We were all part of the kind of meeting organizational committee. Also here, the GATE team, Lechen Liu and Salwe Iqbal, who's been doing some of the photography. There she is. Hi, I can wave. Photography and videos. And also to our ESS Knowledge Mobilization Manager, Tim Kagiri, who's been kind of live tweeting throughout the day, I believe. And again, just another shout out to the booklets that are on the tables or out front. You're welcome to take one with you. We hope you do, because I don't want to have to pay for all the luggage going back. So I hope you enjoy them. I also want to give a special thank you to the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the University of Toronto and the Monk School for Global Affairs and Public Policy, who provided some funding for the international panel that we had earlier in the day. So thank you so much for that. I want to thank the panel moderators, and I should have put up here also some of the student assistants who helped at registration and so forth with other tasks throughout the day. And thanks to Rotman Events, Rotman Facilities, and Pegasus Catering for keeping us very well fed. And again, that fund still continues on in just a minute. Again, a big thank you to those who've provide funding and partnership support for today's meeting, especially a big shout out to Engineers Canada and to the University of Toronto Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering who provide funding, and to the Institute for Gender and Economy that co-sponsored this event with us today. I mean, it's just lovely space and a lovely day to share our science with everyone. So finally, feel free to check out our website if you haven't already, and follow us on social media as we're wrapping up the 7th year of research. We'll be sharing other insights as well as insights from the meeting and follow-ups out to the world. So please join us at the poster session and the reception next door. And just one quick thing is that for the speakers, we're going to be meeting at 6:15 at the reception to walk to dinner. It's just a short time away, so either stick around, or if you want, you can meet us directly at the restaurant if you're one of the invited speakers going to dinner tonight. You know who you are. But maybe let us know if you're going to meet us there. All right, thanks so much.